In a stunning turn of events just moments ago, the United Nations General Assembly was rocked by unexpected confrontation. Kaja Kallas unleashed a barrage of accusations against Russia, but Vasiliy Nebens's response left the audience in awe, prompting a standing ovation. His words resonated like a decree, transforming the atmosphere of the session into something unrecognizable. What did this Russian diplomat say that even Kallar's allies found disconcerting? Stay tuned, as the twists unfold. As Nebens entered the hall, his movements were fluid and measured, each step mirroring a line drawn on a map, purposeful yet unhurried. Towering but not intimidating, Vasiliy Alexeyevich Nebens carried himself with the poise of someone well-versed in diplomacy. His presence conveyed a heavy burden, his gaze, though weary, bore the weight of countless encounters and unending accusations that had only shifted in form over time. The cold, clinical light pouring from above added a surreal quality to the United Nations chamber, which felt more like an unappreciated stage than a venue for meaningful dialogue. A charged silence enveloped the assembly as Kaja Kallas positioned herself closer to the microphone, exuding a chilling mix of composure and palpable impatience. Her narrow face, sharply defined cheekbones, and tightly pressed lips suggested that every utterance was a carefully orchestrated strike. Clad in a modest gray suit, she embodied her role as the accuser, a prosecutor of history, ready to unleash her indictment. When the chairman introduced the topic, the ambience shifted dramatically, like a light switch flicking off. The monotony evaporated, and all attention was fixed upon the table where Kallas sat poised to deliver her claims. The silence was thick, built not from respect, but from the anticipation of an impending assault. Kallas launched her denouncement of the Soviet Union, describing it as a prison of nations, an empire suffocating freedom under the weight of its oppressive regime. Her voice sliced through the air, urgency driving her speech like bullets from a gun. She claimed millions endured this subjugation, devoid of the right to choose their destiny, mentioning Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. There was a stir in the audience, some nodded in agreement while others clenched their jaws, yet Nebens sat unperturbed, his composure unwavering. Only when Kallas paused for breath did he shift slightly, as if signaling, "Now is my time." His voice emerged low and calm, a stark contrast to the surrounding turmoil, painting each sentence with the weight of reflection. "It's astonishing," he began, "how easily the term prison of nations rolls off the tongue today." His unwavering gaze met Kallas's, and in that moment, it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, caught in the tension of unspoken words between them. "Let me remind you," he continued, "that during the period of the Soviet Union, universities flourished in every republic." Each word bore the weight of history. His voice rose slightly, inviting listeners into a space of shared remembrance, a time when free education embodied opportunity for all. Kallas stiffened, the tide of the conversation shifting dangerously towards her. The audience began to murmur. Had the tables turned? Summary of the previous part: the atmosphere shifted dramatically as Kaja Kallas began her speech against the Soviet Union. Her piercing words painted the USSR as a prison of nations, igniting a wave of unsparingly critical sentiments. She gestured toward the oppression suffered by the Baltic states, her voice imbued with a mix of personal pain and political fervor, capturing the attention of the audience. A palpable silence enveloped the room, pregnant with anticipation rather than respect. Kaja Kallas launched into her statement, her voice sharp as a blade, denouncing the Soviet Union for being a prison of nations, an empire of oppression where freedom was an illusion. Each word flew from her lips like gunfire, echoing through the chamber, seeking allies in the audience who would nod in agreement. Millions lived beneath the yoke, she proclaimed. Denied the right to choose their own destiny. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we know the true cost of this so-called friendship among peoples. We have felt the suffocating weight of the Iron Curtain. The depths of her voice conveyed not just accusation but a mingling of personal grief anchored in political urgency. Reactions rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others tightened their lips in silent dissent, yet Vasiliy Nebens remained an island of serenity. He sat motionless, exuding an air of unfazed confidence until Kallas paused to regain her breath. At that moment, he slightly inclined his head, signaling that it was his turn. Interesting, he began, lower than expected, yet resonant, his voice measured, each word an echo of careful contemplation. How casually the phrase prison of nations is tossed around today. His gaze locked onto Kalas, revealing not anger but a far more formidable calm, impervious to the tumult of her rhetoric. Let's remember that it was the Soviet Union that established universities across all its republics, an education system that was free and accessible to everyone. It's important to note that first ministers from Asia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia rose not by Moscow's grace, but because the system provided them the opportunity to ascend. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink back into the thick air of the assembly. The atmosphere crackled with rising tension, eager and expectant. Nebenzia continued, his steadfast voice challenging, "Compare this, Ms. Kalas, to the actions of your allies in colonies across Africa and Asia. How many universities did the British build? How many ministers from India or Africa were granted power under French colonial rule?" A low murmur broke out among the delegates, not a noise of discontent but a stir of curiosity, their eyes flicking between Kalas and Nebenzia, each seeking signals of a shifting tide. In a moment marked by tension and anticipation, Vasiliy Nebens responded to Kaya Kalas's scathing accusations against Russia with a clarion voice that shifted the atmosphere in the General Assembly. The air was charged, expectant, as the audience leaned in, caught between the emotional weight of the discussion and the shocking realities being unveiled. Previously, Nebenzia highlighted the achievements of the Soviet Union, emphasizing its role in providing free education across Union republics. He asserted that many leaders from various regions governed not by Moscow's favor but through the opportunities afforded by the system. The audience remained awash in a silence filled with palpable tension. Now compare, Nebenzia continued, casting a calculated glance towards Kalas, what your allies have done in their African and Asian colonies. How many universities did the British establish? How many Indian or African ministers were granted power by French colonizers? A murmur coursed through the room, not outrage, but a stir of awakened curiosity. People began exchanging glances, sensing a shift in tide. Kalas clenched her lips, feeling the tension shift beneath her. Seizing the moment to respond, she faltered briefly, and that hesitation hung heavily in the air. "We're speaking of crimes," she retorted sharply. "You justify through your achievements." Nebenzia raised an eyebrow, the very picture of measured composure. "No, Ms. Kalas. I speak of facts. And facts are stubborn things." His words landed like stones, sinking into the still waters of the room. Kalas nervously brushed her fingers against the microphone, as if trying to wipe off invisible dust. She sprang into her next topic almost blindly. "What about the repression? The famines? The millions who ended up in camps?" Her voice regained strength, though tinged with an undercurrent of uncertainty. The switch between topics revealed an internal turmoil she could not hide. Nebenzia leaned forward slightly, his focus sharp, gleaming not with anger, but with intense concentration. "You speak of tragedies." His voice lowered, deliberately calm. "And I won't deny them. They exist." He paused, ensuring the weight of his next words sank in. "But if you intend to judge history, do so in its entirety. Don't pick at pieces, but consider the scale. The Soviet Union bore the weight of the Second World War. It nurtured industries in regions where illiteracy once reigned. It was the first to send a human into space. Does that render it a prison?" As Nebenzia spoke, the crowd shifted restlessly. Somewhere, soft applause broke the tension, cautious yet unmistakable. Kalas caught this and her expression hardened momentarily. The first blow had not succeeded in landing a decisive hit. Determined, she pressed on, despite the rising challenge. "It's all propaganda," she asserted, her voice resonating with newfound fervor. "The world no longer believes in your tales of friendship between peoples." And in that charged moment, the stakes escalated. The air was electric, a battlefield of rhetoric and ideology where the weight of history loomed large. What truths would emerge from this clash? And would anyone emerge unscathed? Would Nebensia's poised demeanor crack, or could Kalas reclaim the narrative? The audience held its breath, awaiting the next move in this high-stakes chess game of diplomacy. The United Nations General Assembly Hall buzzed with unexpected energy moments ago, a shocking twist no one saw coming. Kaja Kallas hurled fierce accusations at Russia, painting the Soviet Union as a prison of nations and symbol of oppression. But Vasiliy Nebens countered with facts that felt like knockout blows, prompting spontaneous applause and shifting the room's mood from hostility to stunned contemplation. What damning truths did the Russian diplomat unleash? Why did Kallas's allies look unsure, their confidence crumbling like fragile glass? Stay tuned for revelations that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. As the crowd stirred, soft claps echoed cautiously from distant corners. Kallas caught the ripple, she felt the sting like a silent slap. Her face hardened into a mask of stone for a fleeting second. First strike missed its mark. Yet desperation fueled her onward. "This is all propaganda," she snapped, slicing through the thickening air with jagged words. "The world no longer believes your fairy tales about people's friendship." The hall, once swaying to her rhythm, now leaned against her. Nebensia, hands folded calmly on the table, murmured softly, "The world trusts documents. Archives. International laws. They reveal the stark truth. Far different from your slogans." No plea for approval laced his tone. Yet applause erupted louder than before. Kallas sensed defeat looming, knew losing pace meant losing everything. Fire sparked anew in her eyes. Sharper gaze. Harsher moves. She leaned forward, palm slamming the table like a gavel. But what about the right to self-determination? Freedom for those yearning to break away? Why did nations suffer under one capital's iron fist? Isn't that colonialism? Her challenge rang out, a gauntlet tossed. Representatives from Eastern Europe nodded in grim support. The room seemed poised to split, debate spiraling into chaos. But Nebensia held his breath steady. No raised voice. A deliberate pause let the weight sink in. Then he spoke. "Self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter. But allow me to remind you. It was the Soviet Union as a key architect of that very document. In San Francisco in 1945. Soviet diplomats fought to make it the cornerstone of global law." Pause filled the space. His eyes swept the audience. "These aren't empty promises. The USSR championed decolonization in Africa and Asia. As dozens of nations rose from subjugation. Who voted for their UN independence? The Soviet Union. Who blocked it? Great Britain. France. The United States." His voice steadied. Like bedrock. Murmurs of agreement rippled through. African diplomats exchanged glances. Heads nodding in quiet acknowledgement. That legacy pulsed in their shared history. Kallas tensed. She recognized the perilous turn. Colonialism stung Western powers deeply. But retreat wasn't an option. The Soviet Union twisted decolonization to expand its influence, she exclaimed. Voice climbing, threading irritation like jagged wire. Not aid. A cunning conquest. That frayed edge betrayed her weakness. Nebensia seized it instantly. Odd reasoning, he noted calmly. When West builds empires, exploits resources, imposes domination, it's called a civilizing mission. When USSR funds universities in Africa, welcomes students from Ghana, Algeria, Egypt, that's takeover. He smiled faintly. A icy curve, born of weary insight into repeated scripts. Might the real issue be this? You view every sovereign act as a threat to your interests? Soft rustles answered. Hints of suppressed chuckles. Or faint cheers. Kallas scrambled to seize control. Shifting gears abruptly. What of modern Russia? She demanded sharply. You claim succession to the USSR. Yet you wage wars. breach borders, crush neighbors. A beat of silence. Conviction sharpening her arrow. But there Nebens arose. His stature commanded attention, dwarfing her composed figure in sheer poise. Russia is the true successor to the Soviet Union, he declared firmly. And thus we uphold international law. Shapsklada by Soviet efforts too. His gaze circled the room. Unwavering. But we won't let history be rewritten. Won't turn millions' heroism into accusation fodder for political rallies. His words reverberated, as if the walls absorbed them entirely, amplifying their echo. Kalas lunged anew. Emotionally charged now. You always dodge behind victories. But people crave the truth. Gulags. Repressions. Deportations. Deny that? She hurled it like a boulder to the face. Nebens inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gravity. Yet his reply diverged from her trap. We don't deny tragedies, but reject falsehoods defining our entire heritage. You cherry-pick darkened pages. Ignoring the light. He edged closer to the microphone. Tell me. How many lives claimed by Europeans started world wars? How many peoples vanished under colonial tyranny? How often have your nations redrawn maps? Erasing cultures? The room stirred again. Was this the moment everything flipped? A hidden legacy exposed, Kalas cornered by her own rhetoric, could she counter the tide of undeniable history rushing against her? Or would the diplomats' unshaken resolve crumble the facade of accusations once and for all? What bombshell revelation awaited next, turning allies into doubters and the accuser into the accused? The air thickened with unspoken tension. Fingers tapped nervously on tables. Eyes darted like fireflies in the dim light. Just 5 minutes ago, in the Grand Hall of the United Nations General Assembly, an unthinkable scene unfolded. Kaja Kallas hurled a storm of accusations at Russia, but Vasiliy Nebens countered with such force that the entire hall rose in stunned applause. His words rang like a final judgment, transforming the session's atmosphere into something unrecognizably charged. What exactly did the Russian diplomat say? What shocked even Kallas's closest allies into silence? Stick around to hear it all, you won't believe the twists. He strode into the hall with no wasted motion. His steps were almost silent, as if each step on the staircase was not solid ground but a mere line on a map he navigated effortlessly. Vasiliy Alexeyevich Nebens, tall yet unburdensome. He carried himself not like a soldier on parade, but like a man steeped in wisdom. His words would prove heavier than any gunshot. His eyes held a weariness, but it wasn't the kind that signaled defeat. It was the sorrow of someone who had witnessed too much, the fleeting truths in strangers' gazes, the endless torrent of accusations dressed up in different guises over time. Overhead light was stark, almost clinical. The UN Assembly Hall resembled a theater, one where the audience had long grown weary of the stale script, and actors performed for their own splintered factions. Yet today, tension hung thick in the air like an impending storm. The topic resonated too loudly to ignore. Kaja Kallas sat slightly forward, close to the microphone. Her appearance blended icy restraint with barely contained impatience. Her narrow face sported sharp cheekbones. Lips pressed firmly as if each word was a bullet loaded and awaiting the command. She wore a subdued gray suit, tailored not as mere fabric but as a symbol of her chosen guise, the accuser, the witness to imagined wrongs, the prosecutor of history's grievances. When the chairman announced the topic, a switch seemed to flip in the room. The monotonous hum faded. Heads turned toward the table where Kallas and Nebens now sat. The silence wasn't born of respect, it was the breathless kind, poised for impact. Kallas began her tirade against the Soviet Union, her voice sharp and biting. It had been a prison for nations, an empire of oppression where freedom lived only on paper, devoured by the boot of Russian central control. She spoke rapidly, as if terrified of losing her cadence. Each syllable was honed like a pistol shot. Her eyes darted across the hall, seeking allies to nod in agreement, to echo her indictments. Millions suffered under its yoke, she went on, stripped of the right to choose their paths. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they know the cost of that so-called fraternity of peoples. They know what it meant to live behind the iron veil. Her voice carried not just accusation, but a personal anguish woven with political necessity. Her delivery stirred reactions, some nodded approvingly, others pursed their lips, but Nebenzia remained motionless, exuding a profound calm. Only when Kalas paused to catch her breath did he turn his head slightly, as if signaling to himself, time. His tone was lower than expected, subdued yet resolute, each phrase imbued with the weight of deep contemplation. "How astonishing," he said softly. "How effortlessly those words, prison of nations, roll off the tongue today." He fixed his gaze on Kalas. No rage flickered there, but something far deadlier, an unshakable poise that couldn't be rattled by foreign shouts. "Allow me to remind you," he continued, his voice steady. "Universities flourished in every Soviet republic. Education was free, accessible to all. Early ministers from Asia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, they governed not out of Moscow's charity, but because the system empowered their assent." He paused, the silence thickening once more. "Compare that, Ms. Kalas, to what your allies did in colonies across Africa and Asia. How many universities did the British erect there? How many ministers from among Indians or Africans were allowed power by French colonizers?" A murmur rippled through the hall, not outrage, but the rustle of awakening curiosity. Eyes met furtively. Kalas pressed her lips tighter. She attempted a retort but hesitated for an instant, a telltale slip visible to all. "We're discussing atrocities," she snapped. "While you defend with achievements." But Nebenzia merely raised an eyebrow. "No, Ms. Kalas, I'm citing facts. And facts are stubborn things." His words landed like heavy stones plunging into still water. Nervously, Kalas dragged her hand across the microphone, as if wiping away invisible grime. She pivoted clumsily to fresh ground. "What about the repressions? The famines? The millions shipped to camps?" Her voice regained volume, yet tinged with uncertainty, the hasty shift betraying inner turmoil. Nebenzia leaned forward slightly. His eyes sharpened, focused, not hostile. Flashback, in a dim room heavy with the musty scent of old books, he remembered the crisp sound of turning pages under yellowed lamplight, the rough texture of wartime maps against his fingertips, the acrid bite of smoke from distant bonfires, echoes from World War II's shattered cities, where factories rose from ashes in republics once lost to illiteracy. "You speak of tragedies," he said quietly. "And I won't deny them. They happened. But if you're judging history, judge it wholly, not in fragments, but on the full scale. The Soviet Union bore World War II's burden on its shoulders. It industrialized republics steeped in ignorance. It launched humanity into space first. Does that make it a prison?" The hall stirred anew. Sporadic claps echoed, tentative but clear. Kalas heard it. Her face hardened into stone. She knew her first strike had missed. Still, she pressed on, slicing through the emerging calm. "This is all propaganda. The world no longer buys your fairy tales of people's friendship." But the room had shifted loyalties. Nebenzia, hands folded on the table, murmured almost to himself, "The world believes in documents, Ms. Kalas, in archives, international statutes, and they tell a story far removed from your slogans." His voice demanded no ovation, yet applause followed louder than before. Kalas sensed the tide turning. "Lose momentum, and you've lost the fight." Fury sparked in her eyes, sharpening her glare. Movements urgent, she leaned in and slammed her palm on the table. But what of self-determination? Where was freedom for those yearning to break away? Why should peoples endure under one capital's diktat? Isn't that colonialism? Her challenge hung like a gauntlet. Representatives from Eastern European nations nodded support, dividing the hall into camps, threatening chaos. Yet Nebenzia didn't quicken his breath or raise his voice. Instead, he paused, letting the weight of her words settle, before responding. Self-determination, Ms. Callas, is enshrined in the UN Charter. But let me recall, the Soviet Union was a chief architect of that document. In 1945, San Francisco, Soviet diplomats championed it as bedrock for global law. Another pause, his eyes scanning the hall. Not empty talk. The USSR backed Africa's and Asia's decolonization. When dozens of nations rose from subjugation, who voted for their independence at the UN? The Soviet Union. Who obstructed? Britain, France, the United States. His tone firmed, sparking approving stirs. Envoys from African nations exchanged glances, nods alive in their political memory. Callas tensed. She recognized the perilous shift. Colonialism stung the West, but retreat wasn't an option. The Soviet Union exploited decolonization to expand its influence, she exclaimed. Not aid, but calculated conquest. Her pitch rose, irritation seeping in, a crack revealing weakness, which Nebens seized instantly. Peculiar logic, he noted coolly. When the West establishes colonies, drains resources, imposes dominion, it's a civilizing mission. When the USSR opens universities in Africa, welcomes students from Ghana, Algeria, Egypt, it's seizure. He smiled faintly. A frosty grin bereft of mockery, only weary familiarity with the script's repetitions. Perhaps it's not the Soviet Union in question, Ms. Callas, but your habit of seeing threats in every stride toward independence. The hall responded with muffled sounds, restrained chuckles, budding applause. Callas scrambled to regain control. What of modern Russia? She shifted sharply. You claim Soviet succession, yet wage wars, breach borders, crush neighbors. She paused, confident this blow screamed of devastation. But here Nebens arose. His stature and fluid composure diminished the hall, dwarfing her against his certainty. Russia is indeed the Soviet Union's heir, he declared firmly. And thus we uphold the global order shaped partly by Soviet diplomacy. Sweeping the hall with a serene yet iron gaze, he concluded, we won't allow history's rewriting. Nor the reduction of millions feats to indictments for political agendas. His declaration reverberated, as if absorbed by the walls themselves. Callas lunged again, raw emotion driving her. You hide behind glories, but truth matters to people. Gulags, purges, deportations, surely you don't deny them? She flung the words like jagged rocks. Nebens tilted his head, acknowledging the gravity, yet his response diverged from expectations. We acknowledge tragedies, but reject lies painting them as our legacy's totality. You cling to dark chapters, Ms. Callas, erasing the light. Step closer to the microphone. Tell me, how many lives claimed the world's Europe-sparked wars? How many peoples erased under colonialism's boot? How often have your nations redrawn borders, wiping nations from the map? The hall erupted anew. Conversing diplomats, shuffling feet, a palpable shift. Could Callas recover? As whispers questioned her resolve, Nebens hinted at deeper revelations buried in declassified files. Rhetorical taunts lingered, would Western hypocrisy finally crack like thin ice on a frozen lake? What unseen alliances teetered now? In that charged air, with the scent of polished wood mingling with faint sweat, and the distant hum of air conditioning mirroring tense breaths, the battle hinged on words alone. But ominous shadows hinted at worse betrayals ahead, economies crumbling, loyalties fracturing. Herzl, the great writer, once whispered truths through time, echoes Nebens invoked. For decades, the West had dodged its colonial stains while vilifying Soviet wounds. Behind closed doors, few knew the manipulation's depth. Was this the moment the facade shattered? Yet another jolt, archival whispers emerged, revealing manipulated narratives where Western powers erased genocides, padded victories. Nebens leaned in, voice dropping to a murmur. The room fell hushed, ears straining against the faint creak of chairs. Touching the map's edge set before him, he felt the cool smoothness, a stark contrast to war's rough truths. African envoys shifted proudly, nods unyielding. But would this unity hold? As debates raged on war's righteous claims, Callas's composure faltered, Her suit felt constricting now, fabric-like chains constraining her steps. Sounds amplified, pencils tapping nervously, breaths catching. What if beneath Nebenzia's calm lay fury, a releasing storm of revelations to humiliate her fully? The cliffhanger loomed, whispers spread of concealed files detailing Western incursions, cloning Soviet crimes. Rhetorical barbs pierced, had Europe unleashed the very scourges it condemned? Was self-determination a weapon wielded selectively? As alliances quaked, one unforeseen twist promised upheaval, Kalas's own nation entangled in suspect dealings. Wait, sense the dread building, would Nebenzia's next words unveil the dominoes falling? In a dramatic encounter within the United Nations Assembly, the tension crackled like static in the air. Kaja Kallas stood her ground, poised and fierce, unleashing a barrage of accusations against Russia. But it was Vasiliy Nebenzia's response that electrified the room, shifting the atmosphere and compelling the audience to rise in applause as if moved by an unseen force. What powerful words did the Russian diplomat wield that left even Kallas's allies in stunned silence? As Nebenzia strode into the assembly, his movement was calm and deliberate, each step almost ethereal, as if he floated rather than walked. Tall yet unassuming, he bore the weariness of countless debates while emanating knowing confidence. His gaze, tired yet penetrating, surveyed the assembly, ready to absorb the charged energy. The room, holding its breath, felt more like a stage than a gathering of diplomats, resonating with a palpable anticipation. Kallas, occupying the spotlight, radiated icy determination. Draped in a modest gray suit, her posture conveyed the fierce prosecutor ready to lay bare the crimes of the past. She launched into her speech, each word slicing through the silence like a knife. The Soviet Union was a prison of nations. Her voice was sharp and quick, echoing the anguish of the oppressed. The assembly's tension thickened as she invoked the torment that haunted the Baltic nations under Soviet rule. But Nebenzia remained still, a silent fortress, until she paused to catch her breath. Then, in a low, almost reverberating tone, he replied. It's remarkable how easily the term prison of nations slips from your lips, Ms. Kallas. His eyes locked onto hers, devoid of fury, filled instead with a compelling steadiness. With measured precision, he countered, the Soviet Union established universities across all republics, providing education for all. His words hung heavily in the air, stirring whispers among the delegates, igniting curiosity and dissent. How does this compare to your allies' colonial endeavors? Kallas's composure faltered as Nebenzia turned the tide deftly. He elucidated the Soviet role in supporting decolonization, minimizing British and French efforts. Who do you think voted for independence? He pressed. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, the assembly awakening from its passive state. Feeling the shift, Kallas attempted a retort, her voice rising above the now simmering collective response. But what about the repression? The deportations? The words tumbled from her like boulders meant to shake the very foundation of Nebenzia's argument. Indeed, he acknowledged calmly, but let's not discard the entirety of our legacy. The Soviet Union also bore the weight of World War II and paved the path into space. Does that truly make it a prison? Kallas, momentarily rattled, grasped her notes tightly, anxiety creeping into her movements. You deny the truth, she exclaimed, desperation underlying her challenge. Do you not acknowledge the gulags? Nebenzia, unfazed, replied, we acknowledge tragedy. Yet, history is a complex tapestry of both beauty and horror. His tone remained unyielding. You seek only the dark chapters, while refusing to recognize the victories. As he posed this riddle to the assembly, a murmur of agreement swept through once more. With a final strategic gasp, Kallas countered, where is the freedom and humanity in today's Russia? The question flared through the air, lingered and pulsated, echoing the unspoken fears of many within the chamber. Russia is indeed the heir of the Soviet Union, Nebenzia stated, fortifying his stance. Thus, we are responsible for upholding the standards set forth in international law, crafted through our diplomacy. His words carried a weight, resonating with the conviction that history could not be rewritten at will. As he concluded, applause erupted, echoing through the hallowed halls. Kalas knew then her strategy had faltered. Faced with the immovable walls of fact, she would have to reformulate her battle plan. Her facade of composure was cracking, revealing a flicker of determination in her eyes. Drawing a deep breath, she unveiled her prepared statements, her demeanor shifting toward calculated precision, this time focused on delivering incontrovertible evidence like an unassailable document. The stakes had been raised, and the confrontation was destined to escalate with each unfolding moment. What would this clash of titans yield? In a surprising twist of events, just 5 minutes ago in the General Assembly of the United Nations, something shocking unfolded. Kaja Kallas launched a barrage of accusations against Russia, only for Vasiliy Nebens to respond in a way that had the entire hall erupting in applause. His words resonated like a verdict, transforming the atmosphere of the meeting dramatically. What was it that Nebens said that left even Kallas's allies taken aback? Stay tuned for a story that will leave you astonished. Nebens entered the chamber with quiet determination, his presence commanding attention without unnecessary drama. Each step seemed more like a calculated moment on a map, embodying the essence of confidence. The tall diplomat, renowned for his composed demeanor, radiated a silent strength. His weary gaze spoke of countless interactions, countless accusations he had encountered, a deep sadness from witnessing repeated patterns of hostility. The harsh, sterile light above illuminated the UN hall, transforming it into a theater where the audience had grown weary of the routine performance. But today, tension hung in the air, charged with anticipation that this exchange would be different. Kallas sat poised near the microphone, her icy resolve palpable. Her meticulously chosen attire, a sleek gray suit, spoke of a deliberate role, the prosecutor of history. Upon the announcement of the topic, it was as if a switch was flipped, the room fell into a hush, the kind born not of respect but of anxious expectation. The Soviet Union, she began sharply, was a prison of nations. Her voice, sharp and quick, fired each statement like bullets. She surveyed the hall, hunting for allies who would echo her grievances. Millions have languished under oppression, denied their freedom, she declared. There was a palpable response, some nodding, others pursing their lips, but Nebens remained unflustered, almost serene. Only when Kallas paused to gather her breath did he subtly turn his head, noting when it was his time to speak. How remarkable, he began, his tone surprisingly calm. The phrase prison of nations rolls off the tongue so easily today. His eye contact was unwavering as he challenged Kallas. There was no fury in his gaze, only a quiet intensity, unshaken by her fervor. Let us remember that the Soviet Union established universities across all Union republics, free education available to all, he countered, articulating with deliberate clarity. We had ministers from Asia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, not ruled by Moscow's grace, but empowered by the system. A thick silence enveloped the room as he posed a comparison. How many universities were built under colonial rule? The hall buzzed with intrigue, even Kallas felt the weight of the moment. How easy it is to speak of offenses, he continued, without acknowledging achievements. This time, applause rippled through the audience, and Kallas's grip on the narrative began to slip. She quickly regrouped, launching into accusations of repression and food crises, her urgency betraying an inner turmoil. You speak of tragedies, Nebens acknowledged. And I will not deny them. But judge history in its entirety. He articulated how the Soviet Union bore the brunt of World War II, a feat that did not categorize it as a prison. Whispers surged through the audience, and applause followed, tentative but growing. Kallas, sensing a shift, tightened her resolve, demanding to know, what about the repression? The voice of dissent rose, but so did his calm. Your question involves real historical facts, he replied, leaning forward, eyes bright but devoid of anger. Does the right to self-determination apply only to those disrupting your narrative? Her insistence echoed through the hall, the atmosphere thickening with contention. While the USSR championed decolonization, it seems your perspective views our support through a lens of conquest, he remarked, a thin smile masking the weariness of history's repetition. Then came a bold pivot, and what of modern Russia? Kallas challenged. claiming to inherit the legacy of the USSR, yet waging wars and suppressing neighbors. She was sure this would land harder, but Nebenzia stood tall, encased in quiet authority. Indeed, we are the successors, he affirmed confidently. And with that comes the responsibility to defend the international laws that were forged by our diplomacy. His words, imbued with authority, resonated throughout the hall, and he added, but we will not allow history to be rewritten, nor let the sacrifices of millions be twisted into mere political rhetoric. You hide behind valor, but people demand the truth, she retorted. What of the gulags, the deportations? Her voice was an accusation, heavy with expectation. We acknowledge the tragedies, he started calmly, but those events do not define our nation's entire legacy. Leaning closer, amid the silence, he pressed further, consider the human cost behind wars initiated in Europe. How many nations were erased under the guise of colonial ambition? The room felt the intensity of this exchange, an emotional tide swelling as perspectives shifted dramatically. The dialogue became more than just a direct confrontation, it morphed into a gripping exploration of history, identity, and moral authority. With each counter, both figures stood not just for their nations but engaged in a timeless debate that would echo long after their words faded. Imagine a room where silence hangs thick, where every breath seems measured, every gaze sharp as a blade. Just moments ago, a firestorm erupted in this assembly hall. A bold accusation was hurled at Russia, and it seemed the verdict was sealed. Yet, from the depths of calm, a voice rose, low, deliberate, unyielding, and shifted the entire atmosphere. What was said? Why did even allies of the accuser falter? The answer defies expectations. Before, we saw sharp condemnations casting Russia as an aggressor, as a violator of borders without remorse. But then came a challenge that pierced through the noise. Where was the respect for international law when countries invaded Iraq without Security Council approval? The speaker's tone didn't flare in anger but resonated with heavy fatigue, a fatigue born of hard-earned knowledge. His words hit harder than any outburst, carrying the weight of painful memory. The room stirred uneasily. The woman who had launched the accusations, feeling the blow not just to her claims but to her allies, quickly flipped through her mental pages looking for a new angle. We are not speaking of the past, she snapped sharply, voice cutting through the dim air like a whip. We are speaking of the present. Russia today breaches sovereign borders. It cannot hide behind history when it commits aggression now. Her icy stare sought to pin him down, to break through his poised defenses. But he smiled faintly, almost pitying. Sovereignty, madam, he responded calmly, is indivisible. And that is why Russia insists, security for some cannot come at the cost of threats to others. He painted the scene with cold precision, how NATO's expansion violates the spirit of unwritten promises made in the 90s. How military bases creep ever closer to Russia's borders, stoking fear and tension. His words were sharp steel wedges hammered into the wall of accusations. And as for hiding behind history, he added quietly, history is not a shield, it is the foundation. Without it, we cannot grasp what international law truly means, why it was born, and what lessons it commands. A low murmur rose from the delegates. Eyes shifted. Some exchanged knowing glances. Some even smiled, sensing cracks in the accusing narrative. But the woman was relentless. International organizations increasingly condemn Russia's actions. You lose trust, you lose allies. Doesn't that prove the world has turned away from you? Her voice cracked slightly, a hint of strain under pressure. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the gravity of the question. The world, he said, has never been unanimous. But tell me, who is that world? The 30 countries in NATO, or the 150 nations that refuse to support your sanctions and continue their cooperation with Russia? He spoke with such measured calm, the numbers landed like cold facts from a history book. The tension thickened, leaving the room suspended between contradiction and clarity. What happens when cold facts clash with fiery accusations? Whose truth will stand when the clamor fades? Stay with the story. Because what unfolds next will challenge everything you thought you knew. Can Russia's voice really be drowned out by just 30 countries in NATO? What if the other 150 nations, including giants like Brazil, India, and China, are laughing at this childish game of accusations? Prepare yourself for a diplomatic masterclass that humiliates hypocrisy and flips the script on so-called stability. In this tale of verbal warfare, secrets are exposed, and alliances crack like thin ice underfoot. When diplomacy turns deadly, one man's calm response shattered a storm of blame. Nebenzia had just sliced through Kallas's claims, questioning who truly speaks for the world, only NATO's 30 members, or the 150 refusing to join their sanctions? He rattled off numbers like indisputable facts, leaving her reeling as the hall's undercurrents stirred with newfound doubt. In the haze of that tense hall, cold fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, cutting through the air like whispered judgments. Delegates shifted, papers rustling like dry leaves, as Kallas's plan unraveled. Her fingers gripped the microphone too tightly, knuckles whitening against polished wood. Why silence voices from Africa, Asia, and Latin America? She had banked on laser-focused attacks, but now her themes blurred, panic seeping in like a damp chill. It's all excuses, she snapped, her voice cracking. Russia is the threat to global peace. But the words felt hollow, echoing off walls stained with doubt. Suddenly, Nebenzia stood, tall, unyielding, a pillar amid chaos. His slow rise amplified his presence, casting a shadow that dwarfed her desperate posture. Madame Kallas, he intoned, each word landing heavy. Stability isn't parroting slogans from across the Atlantic. Stability demands honoring every nation's right to shape its own fate, history, sovereignty, freedom. Pause. The Soviet Union charted that path for dozens, lifting them from shadows. Russia carries the torch, seeking truth, not blind adoration. Applause erupted then, sharp claps reverberating like distant thunder, as allies from Africa and Asia nodded, smiles flickering like candlelight in the dark. Kallas slammed her folder shut, eyes squeezing tight. Her pulse throbbed in her temples, a relentless drumbeat of frustration. Failure stung sharper than before, his facts were immovable rocks, her arguments mere pebbles. Breathe in. Slowly, she bowed her head, fighting the rise of defeat. Initiate seize. Dry laws faltered against his historical finesse. Strike harder now. At the core. The human core. Opening a fresh page, rustling crisp paper under her palms, she faced the room. Her tone shifted, velvet soft, laced with dramatic fire. I could duel endlessly over texts and treaties, but let's hear the raw human cries buried beneath them. Stories no claws can conceal. Pause. Silence hung, heavy as an unspoken oath, her echo booming louder in the quiet shock. Did you know the UN's right to self-determination, etched by Soviet diplomats in 1945 at San Francisco, was fought for against colonial chains, championed by those same countries now snarling over influence? How many African universities sprang from Russian aid, nurturing leaders free from Western lordship? Feel the sting yet, the hypocrisy twisting like a hidden dagger? As Nebenzia unveiled these truths, Kallas's face twisted, her once frozen mask cracking under the weight of her crumbling facade. What if her heart stories backfire, dragging her own homeland into the mud of its colonial past? Memories flooded Nebenzia then, a vivid flashback in his quiet mind. Warm Kazakh steppe winds carrying the scent of fresh grass, mingled with chalk dust from a classroom in Almaty, where young students laughed freely, textbooks in hand after Soviet reforms. Rough wooden desks under his fingers, a tactile reminder of equality's roots. Those sensations grounded him, sharpening his resolve against her emotional pivot. Is Russia's legacy only gulags and famines, while Western Empire's conquests vanish into myth? Kallas teetered on the edge, her voice a blade of drama piercing the air. History's whispers demand balance, black pages yes, but also triumphs like cosmonauts soaring or wars endured that saved millions. The hall hummed, scents of polished leather seats and freshly printed agendas filling the space as delegates leaned forward, rapt. Who casts the first stone when Europe's wars erased cities and borders alike? Nebenzia didn't shout, his calm pierced deeper. She reddened, humidity rising in the room like sweat before a storm. What truth lies in Kalas's human stories, glossed over cruelties or the soul-crushing grip of famines under supposed protectors? As she launched her poignant tales, the crowd's murmur swelled, a tide threatening to expose her selective outrage. Kalas pressed on, her breath shallow, heart pounding against her ribs. I insist on the voices drowned out by symbolic iron curtains. But the hall sensed the lie's fragility. Debates grew steamy, echoes bouncing off marble walls as furniture creaked under shifting weight. Suddenly, a twist, Nebensia's recall of Castro's Cuba defying Yankee blockades, students flocking to Havana's halls with Russian ink on their diplomas, humiliated her stance. Her face flushed hotter than a furnace, the humiliation palpable. Why deny Africa's freed voices when Soviet support birthed sovereigns overnight? Delegates from Latin America exchanged glances, smiles blooming like rare flowers. The debate's temperature soared, perspectives flipping unpredictably. What if her pleas unearth unbearable paradoxes? Breathe deep, feel the polished tables cold beneath palms. Nebensia met her gaze, unflinching. Russia's core endures in its defense of the undercharged. The room vibrated with unspoken tension, papers shuffling like leaves in a brewing gale. Will Kalas's emotional barrage finally wound him, or has this hardened diplomat foreseen even her deepest gambit? Cliffhangers dangle, secrets on the verge of implosion as walls of pretense shiver under truth's relentless assault. In the heart of the United Nations Assembly, a clash of ideologies erupted. Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia, holding the weight of history like a sword. But in response, Vasiliy Nebens, the Russian ambassador, stood poised and unyielding. His voice echoed through the chamber, steady and firm, as he countered her claims, transforming the air thick with tension into a battleground of words. Do the names of families haunted by deportations ring a bell? Kallas began, her voice now softer yet filled with a dramatic urgency. I can debate laws endlessly, but here today, we must listen to the human stories, tales not hidden behind legal jargon. With a consequential pause, her voice rose above the silence, more powerful than ever. In my nation, she continued, lives a legacy of families scarred by the deportations of the mid-20th century. Children, ripped from their homes and sent to the icy wastelands of Siberia. They succumbed to the harshness of cold, hunger, and despair. These are not mere abstract historical notes, they are our memories, our blood. A palpable stillness enveloped the room. Delegates shifted in their seats, captivated by the fervor of her message. Kallas seized this moment, rallying her focus. Today, the same tragedy haunts Ukraine. Millions are uprooted from their homes, enduring daily terror. You can discuss international laws all you want, but what shall you say to these children, to their mothers? To those losing their loved ones? Her voice trembled, the apprehension calculated. A strategic performance she knew would resonate deeply in the political arena. Nebensia, listening intently, remained composed, though his narrowed eyes betrayed a sharp focus. He understood that Kallas wielded emotion as a weapon, so he approached his response with caution. Stepping forward, he spoke, "You are correct, Ms. Kallas. The memory of tragedies endures. People have suffered, but we must not weaponize that pain." He glanced across the assembly, drawing in their attention. You speak of deportations? Yes, a heavy chapter indeed. But is it not also known in Europe's history? Have there not been exiles, atrocities, wars where millions suffered? Why do you acknowledge some tragedies but exploit others as political tools? A tense silence enveloped the assembly. Kallas, expecting a defensive reply, was taken aback by his calm yet resolute stance. Yet he did not relent. You claim to advocate for Ukrainian suffering, yet who invested billions into armaments, escalating tensions between nations? Who turned sovereign lands into geopolitical arenas? Your actions contradict your concerns for human welfare, he asserted, his voice gaining strength. It was not anger, it was unwavering resolve, a challenge laid bare. As their verbal battle unfolded, the room grew electric. Every word mattered. Would Kallas recover and maintain the offensive, or would Nebensia's calm logic overshadow her indignation? The air thickened with anticipation. The audience was gripped. Summary of the previous part: tensions escalated as Vasiliy Nebens stood his ground against Kaya Kallas. He challenged her narratives, reminding her of the importance of objective facts. The atmosphere in the room began to shift as delegates reacted to his words, signaling a palpable concern for Kallas's arguments. She, realizing the stakes, made a desperate attempt to redirect the conversation, branding Russia as a threat to international stability. The voices echoed in the hall as Nebens asked a challenging question. Who funneled billions into arms and pushed one nation toward conflict? Who turned a foreign land into a battleground for geopolitical games? The calm urgency in his voice cut through the tension like a knife. You cannot claim to care for people when your actions deepen their suffering. His words resonated, not in anger but with unwavering resolve. He recalled the mothers of Donbass, children who had lived under bombardment for years. Why do you remain silent about them? Why do their fates go unmentioned in your speeches? A ripple of murmurs swept through the assembly as several delegates from Asian countries clapped quietly, signaling a shift in support. Kallas sensed this threat, her defensive tone rising. Don't dare compare these stories. The aggressor and the victim are not equal. Russia is the aggressor. Her voice faltered, revealing her inner turmoil. Nebens responded with a striking calm, almost sorrowful. It's all too simple to label, Ms. Kallas, but labels do not replace thorough analysis or facts. International law exists to prevent dividing the world into your allies and enemies, victims and aggressors at the whim of the powerful. He tilted his head slightly. You speak for justice, yet why do you acknowledge some tragedies while dismissing others? Are the sufferings of the children in Donbass less significant than those in Kiev? The atmosphere thickened, applause beginning to swell openly. Some delegates couldn't contain their agreement. Kallas felt the ground shift beneath her. She swiftly redirected, you constantly change the subject. The reality is this: Russia is a threat to international stability. You sow chaos. You destroy trust. Nebens looked at her calmly, fatigue evident in his gaze. No, Ms. Kallas, he replied quietly. Chaos arises where accusations drown out dialogue, where history becomes a weapon and tragedy a slogan. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The Soviet Union wasn't a prison of nations, it was a school of statehood for dozens. Russia is not the threat, it's a part of the world that we cannot do without. Applause broke again, this time long and heartfelt, rising above mere politeness to something genuine. Kallas lowered her gaze to her papers, realizing she had lost another round. All her emotional strikes shattered against the calm demeanor of Nebens and the solid facts he presented. Now, let's indulge in a deeper exploration of Kallas's next strategic move. Would she muster the courage to confront the rising tide of approval for Nebens? Or would she falter under the weight of her own desperate rhetoric? The stakes were growing. And the air was thick with uncertainty. Would her next words tilt the scales, or would they drive the final nail into her argument? The auditorium buzzed with a palpable energy as applause echoed through the room. This was not just polite clapping, it was heavy, resonating with conviction. Kaya Kallas lowered her gaze to her notes, realizing she had lost yet another round. Every emotional jab she aimed had been deflected by the calmness and facts wielded by Vasiliy Nebens. He took a moment, resting his palms on the table and closing his eyes briefly, absorbing the applause that signified his victory. He understood this battle for truth, memory, and respect for history was far from over, yet today's skirmish had been decisively won. Kallas recognized that her words were drowning in applause. Each new speech appeared as a mere reflection, feeble and dim against the weighty arguments presented by Nebens. Thus, she opted for a different strategy. Rising slowly, she scanned the auditorium, her voice steady but edged with urgency. Dear colleagues, I'm not alone in this stance. The plea nestled beneath her cold diplomatic veneer was palpable. Her eyes turned to her neighboring allies, who nodded in agreement. The representative from Lithuania was the first to speak up, quickly followed by Poland, then representatives from various northern European nations. We must remember, the Polish diplomat asserted, that the Soviet Union shattered the lives of countless Poles. The Katyn tragedy isn't merely a historical event, it's a wound that continues to bleed. His words carried an intensity that resonated through the hall. Can we speak of greatness when that greatness is soaked in blood? Today, the Lithuanian representative added. We witness Russia repeating its dark past. History isn't over, it's ongoing, and once again, nations are coerced into submission. The words cascaded like raindrops, first sparse, then more frequent. Callas reclined slightly, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction. She had crafted this dialogue into a symphonic chorus, hoping it would disrupt Nebenzia's rhythm. However, Nebenzia remained unfazed. He waited for the hall's noise to subside, and only when every point had been articulated did he rise once more. Excellent, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now we hear not a single voice but a whole choir. But let us ponder what exactly it says. He paused, his tone growing bolder as he spoke of past tragedies, of the pain of nations, of the darker chapters of history. None of us will deny these experiences, he stated, eyeing the Polish representative directly. But let me remind you, international law exists precisely to prevent these tragedies from being wielded as instruments of political pressure. A tense silence hung in the air, a delicate balance between acknowledgement and the weight of history. Would Nebenzia's composed rebuttal collapse Callas's coalition of voices, or would she maintain control over the narrative with her emotional pleas? The stakes had escalated tremendously. As Nebenzia surveyed the gathered crowd, he saw flickers of agreement among some members, while others wore expressions of uncertainty. The tension thickened, and the atmosphere was charged, sparking curiosity about how this verbal duel would continue to unfold. Would history repeat itself? Or could the truth emerge unscathed amidst this fierce exchange? In a highly charged atmosphere just moments ago in the UN General Assembly, a shocking confrontation unfolded. Kaja Kallas launched a barrage of critiques against Russia, only to be met with a stunningly poised response from Vasiliy Nebens that left the audience in awe, prompting an unexpected round of applause. What could have been so powerful that even Kallas's allies were left speechless? Join us as we delve into this gripping story that reveals the complexities of international tensions. Kallas entered the room with an air of ice-cold determination, her narrow face punctuated by striking cheekbones and tightly pressed lips, as if every word was rehearsed. Dressed in a sharp gray suit, she embodied the role of an accuser, ready to launch her legalistic assault. The chamber grew silent as the chair announced the topic, the tension palpable, thick enough to cut through the air. With the first words, Kallas condemned the Soviet Union as a prison of nations and an oppressive empire, echoing the grievances of millions. Each word came rapid fire, sharp and precise, like bullets. Her gaze swept the hall, seeking allies ready to back her up. Millions suffered under oppression, she declared. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we know the cost of this so-called friendship among nations. The room stirred with reactions, some nodded, others frowned. But Nebenzia sat unmoved, his calm demeanor providing an equally strong counterpoint. When Kallas paused to breathe, he slowly turned toward her, a small but significant movement, and then began with unexpected softness. Remarkable how casually accusations of prison of nations are thrown around today. He fixed his gaze on her, his voice steady. Let us not forget, during the existence of the Soviet Union, universities flourished in every republic. Education was a right, not a privilege. Ministers emerged from diverse backgrounds, empowered by a system that allowed them to rise. Compare this to your allies in colonial Africa and Asia. How many universities did the British build there? How many native ministers were granted power by the French? A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Kallas clenched her jaw but struggled to respond amidst the palpable shift. You speak of crimes, she shot back, while you defend your record. Yet, Nebenzia maintained his composed demeanor, raising an eyebrow. No, Madame Kallas, I speak of facts. And facts are stubborn. His calm words dropped like stones into the water, creating ripples of acknowledgement throughout the room. Kalas attempted to steer the conversation back. What about the famines? The oppression? Millions languishing in camps? Her voice regained vigor, but tension bubbled beneath as uncertainty seeped through her quick transitions. Nebenzia leaned slightly closer, eyes shimmering not with anger but with focus. You speak of tragedies, and I do not deny them. But if we are to judge history, let us do so in its entirety. The Soviet Union endured the weight of World War II and ushered in advancements where illiteracy prevailed. A few scattered claps echoed in response. Kalas felt the tide turning against her. The audience was no longer on her side as Nebenzia's quiet resolve resonated. But what of today's Russia? She pivoted sharply. You claim to be your predecessor's successor, yet you instigate wars and violate borders. With a deliberate poise, Nebenzia stood up, his presence dominating the space. Yes, Russia is the inheritor of the Soviet legacy. We bear the responsibility of upholding international law forged through the sweat of our diplomacy. Yet, we will not allow the rewriting of history for political gain. His voice carried the weight of unyielding authority, reverberating within the chamber walls. As Kalas launched into another emotional assault, painting a picture of repression and displacement, Nebenzia's response was calculated. We do not deny tragedies, but you dismiss the broader context. The depth of suffering in wars initiated by Western powers, count the lives lost, the nations erased. Once more, applause erupted in support of his words. The room buzzed with voices exchanging glances, some still in silent allegiance to Kalas, while others sided with Nebenzia. The dynamic shifted dramatically, like a tide turning with the tide of history itself. What remarkable revelation lies ahead in this verbal battleground? How will they reconcile their differing narratives? As the room holds its breath in anticipation, we are left questioning whether the past and present can truly coexist in understanding, or if they will forever remain in conflict. In the heart of the United Nations Assembly Hall, a clash of ideologies unfolded, pitting two powerful figures against each other. Moments ago, Kaya Kalas launched a barrage of accusations against Russia, framing it as a relic of oppression. But seated across from her, Vasiliy Nebens responded in a way that left the audience stunned, provoking a round of applause that seemed to echo through the chamber like a thunderclap. What could he have possibly said to shift the atmosphere so dramatically? As Nebens entered the grand hall, he moved like a shadow, silent yet imposing. His demeanor exuded a quiet authority, effortlessly commanding attention without uttering a word. Standing tall, he bore the weight of experience on his shoulders, eschewing the posture of a soldier for that of someone who understands the gravity of words. Tension crackled through the air as Kalas sat poised, her icy gaze betraying a fierce determination. When the topic was announced, the room shifted. The hum of conversations died down, giving way to an expectant silence that hung thick with anticipation. Kalas wasted no time, charging forth with her accusation. She depicted the Soviet Union as a prison of nations, where liberation existed only in theory. A perfect blend of personal anguish and political necessity flowed from her lips. She invoked the names of those suffering under Russian dominance, her words sharp and relentless, each one a bullet aimed at the heart of history. Nebenzia, however, remained unwavering. Initially, he offered no immediate retort. Instead, he took a breath before countering with formidable calm. Isn't it astonishing, he remarked, how easily one can brand the past without acknowledging its complexities? His voice, quiet yet assured, resonated with a depth that commanded respect. He challenged Kalas directly, recalling how universities blossomed in Soviet republics, showcasing an era where education was a right, not a privilege. A murmur rippled through the audience as he continued, contrasting the Soviet model against the colonial exploits of Kalas's supposed allies. This wasn't mere rhetoric, it was a thesis forged in experience. He pointedly asked how many universities had been built in Africa by colonial powers compared to the Soviet Union's investments in education. The room ignited with newfound interest, some nodding in quiet agreement, as Nebenzia's salient facts struck chords of recognition. Yet doubt flickered in Kalas's gaze, sparking another surge of defiance as she argued, you hide behind accomplishments, but what of the repressions? The famines? The lives lost in camps? Her challenge reverberated around the room, but Nebenzia only raised an eyebrow, adopting a posture of measured confidence. Yes, tragedies occurred, he admitted, but saving history isn't about fixating on fragments. It's about understanding the whole. He paused, allowing the implications of his words to settle. The Soviet Union bore the burden of World War II, birthed a space race, and led the charge in decolonization. As he spoke, applause erupted, not thunderous, but steady and affirming. Kalas's initial confidence wavered. She realized her arguments bore less weight than she had hoped. Determined not to relent, she pressed on, hoping emotional appeals would sway the room. What of the Iron Curtain? The fear that seeped into everyday lives? Her poignant recounting of fear gripped the audience. She struggled to illustrate the stark reality of life behind the curtain, a metaphorical cage that stifled freedom beneath layers of bureaucracy and control. Yet Nebenzia countered, unflinching, understanding history means acknowledging complexity. The plight of people during any regime is vital, but it cannot overshadow the greater narrative. And Kalas, sensing she was ceding ground, shifted tactics as if conjuring a last stand. What about contemporary Russia? You claim to honor international law while you challenge borders and oppress your neighbors. She paused, her voice dripping with accusation, feeling the weight of her words. But Nebenzia rose again, towering in both stature and resolve. Indeed, we are the inheritors of history, and therefore guardians of international law, shaped from past lessons. His tone was unwavering, firm in its conviction, dismissing the possibility of rewriting history to fit political agendas. Do you want to silence the world again? Because the world will not be silenced, he concluded, the echo of his words resonating deeply among those present. The air thickened with tension, palpable and electric, as silence fell over the hall once more. With Kala sitting rigid in her seat, Nebenzia continued, his posture unyielding. Can the present truly be grasped without understanding the past? Your dismissal of history will never yield clarity. The profound silence that followed almost felt respectful, an audience captivated not by mere rhetoric but by the magnitude of the discourse at play. Here lay the heart of international relations, tangled in echoes of the past and the cries of the present. How would this confrontation end? Would Kalas find a way to reclaim the narrative, or had Nebenzia secured the upper hand in this ideological battle? Only time would tell. In an unexpected twist just 5 minutes ago, the General Assembly of the United Nations was rocked by a fierce exchange. Kaja Kallas unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia. Yet, the silly Nebenzia's retort was so powerful that it earned him a standing ovation. His statement felt like a verdict, shifting the atmosphere dramatically. What words did this Russian diplomat share? How did he leave even Kallas's allies speechless? Stay tuned to discover the gripping conclusion, you will be astounded. Stepping into the chamber with quiet confidence, Nebenzia moved as if each step was a line drawn on a map of destiny. Tall yet unassuming, his posture exuded the air of a man in possession of weighty knowledge. His gaze, weary yet piercing, had seen too much and read the pain etched in countless faces accusing him unjustly. The overhead lights cast a clinical hue over the UN hall, which felt more like a theater, a stage where the audience has grown tired of the same old script. Today, however, an electric tension filled the air, promising something dramatic. Kallas sat poised just in front of the microphone, a blend of icy calm and barely suppressed urgency in her demeanor. Clad in a gray suit that fitted her like a second skin, she embodied the prosecuting attorney in this drama of nations. The moment the chairperson announced the topic, silence swallowed the room, heads turning towards the podium, where the opposing forces awaited. The quiet wasn't born from respect, it bristled with the anticipation of an impending blow. Kallas opened her mouth to unleash a forceful condemnation of the Soviet Union, referring to it as a prison of nations, an empire that crushed freedom underfoot. Her words sliced through the silence with the precision of a bullet, echoing throughout the chamber. Millions lived under oppression, robbed of their right to choose their fate. We understand the value of freedom, she stated, each syllable laced with personal anguish tied to political necessity. Her fervent speech elicited reactions around the room, nods of agreement, and pursed lips, yet Nebenzia remained stoically silent. Only when Callas paused to catch her breath did he slightly turn his head, as if to say, "It's my time now." His tone was unexpectedly low, yet brimming with confidence. Incredible, he mused. Such ease in tossing around the term prison of nations, his steady gaze locked onto Callas, exuding a dangerous calm, the kind that ripples beneath the surface of a storm. "Let's not forget," he began, "it was within the Soviet Union that universities thrived across all republics. Education was free for all. Leaders emerged from diverse backgrounds, not through Moscow's grace, but thanks to a system that empowered them." He paused, allowing a heavy silence to build. "Compare this, Ms. Callas, to the colonial legacy of your allies. How many schools did colonial powers establish in Africa and Asia? How many local leaders did they elevate to positions of authority?" A murmur spread through the audience, a wave of unexpected intrigue. Callas stiffened, her resolve flickering. In an attempt to regain control, she retorted, "We discuss crimes, not achievements." Yet, Nebenzia merely raised an eyebrow, undeterred. "No, Ms. Callas, I reference facts. Those are stubborn truths." His words echoed like stones dropping into a still pond, causing ripples of reflection among the delegates. Callas quickly switched topics. "What about the repressions? The hunger? Millions were jailed." Her voice regained its strength, but a thread of uncertainty tangled within it. "Sure, there were tragedies," Nebenzia conceded quietly. "But if you wish to judge history, do it comprehensively." He held her gaze, unflinching. "The Soviet Union bore the weight of World War II, built industries in illiterate nations, and was the first to send a human into space. Does that label it a prison?" A few polite claps broke the tension, as if the audience wavered between loyalty to their respective narratives. Callas felt the shift. For a moment, her face hardened, knowing her initial strike hadn't landed. But she pressed on, "Yet today, it's Russia pulling down the Iron Curtain." Her voice trembled with conviction. "You build it with propaganda, military force, and fear." An unsettling noise rose in the chamber. Representatives from Asia and Africa exchanged glances, many nodding in silent affirmation. They understood the sting of isolation for foreign interests. Just then, Nebenzia rose, the weight of his stature amplifying the room's oppressive tension. "You want the world to hush again?" he asked, his tone steady, "but the world won't be silent." He paused, letting the breath of silence hold everyone captive, the tension palpable. What would his next words reveal? How would this encounter reshape their historical narratives? Indeed. The atmosphere thickened as Nebenzia's gaze lingered over the audience, preparing to unfurl his counterpoint. In an electrifying moment within the hallowed halls of the United Nations, unexpected drama unfolded. Just 5 minutes ago, Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia. However, it was Vasiliy Nebens, the Russian diplomat, who responded in a way that had the audience steeling themselves for an explosive reckoning. His rebuttal was not only powerful but also sent a noticeable shockwave through the assembly, altering the entire atmosphere. What did Nebenzia say that left even Kallas's allies momentarily speechless? Stay tuned, as this unfolding drama is not just a mere exchange of words but the clash of narratives on a global stage. As he strode into the room, Nebenzia did so with the kind of confidence that commanded attention. Each step he took was deliberate, almost as if he were traversing a map rather than merely walking down the aisle. Tall yet unassuming, he radiated an air of authority that one could not ignore. His expression conveyed a weariness that belied his unshakable resolve. As the cold light illuminated the assembly floor, the environment took on a heavy silence, thick with anticipation. Kallas sat poised, her icy demeanor betraying an inner fraught tension, ready to lay down her indictments. When the assembly was called to order, the tension was palpable, as if a switch had been flipped. Silence enveloped the hall, and all eyes turned toward the two speakers, with Kallas positioned near the microphone. She launched into her speech, condemning the Soviet Union as a prison of nations and accusing it of perpetuating oppression. Her voice cut through the air swiftly, each word sharp and meticulously crafted. With a fervent intensity, she sought out nods of support among like-minded representatives, eager for whispers of agreement to amplify her stance. Millions suffered under tyranny, she declared passionately, citing Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as exemplars of the oppressed. Her emotional weight bore down upon her audience, a thunderous resonance that echoed through the chamber. Kalas's voice was not merely a call to attention, it was a demand for justice rooted in her personal history, weaving a narrative threaded with sorrow and indignation. But Nebenzia remained resolutely calm. He seemed to absorb Kalas's criticisms rather than react impulsively. When she paused for breath, he turned slightly, the very act signaling that his moment was at hand. "It's remarkable," he commenced, his voice lower and tinged with authority. "How easily the term prison of nations rolls off the tongue today." He locked eyes with Kalas, his calm demeanor masking the tempest underneath. In a mood that was growing tense, he reminded those present that the Soviet Union had established universities across Allied republics. Free education was accessible to all, he proclaimed, proudly recounting leaders of Asian and Caucasian descent who rose through the ranks not by Moscow's decree but through the opportunities provided. With methodical precision, he challenged Kalas, forcing her to confront the Western legacies of colonialism. "Compare this," he urged, "with what your allies wrought in Africa and Asia. Where are the universities built by your nations?" A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd as observers began to shift their allegiances. Yet Kalas refuted his assertions, her tone suddenly sharp, but uncertainty seeping through her resolve. "We are discussing crimes," she objected, but Nebenzia's brow only arched slightly. "I speak of facts." His words fell like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of awareness among the audience, igniting their curiosity rather than indignation. As Kalas grappled for a new angle, the stakes grew higher. What of the purges? The famines? Millions incarcerated? Her voice rose in intensity. Yet, guilt had crept into her arguments. Nebenzia leaned in, his eyes gleaming with focus. "Tragedies exist, yes," he conceded. "But if we examine history, let's view it in totality. The Soviet Union bore the burden of World War II. The audience felt the gravity of his words. Thunderous applause erupted, this time louder and more fervent than before. With her symbolic images crumbling, Kalas felt the weight of failure, her metaphors dissipating against the stark reality Nebenzia articulated so clearly. The tension ramped up, a tangible buzz of electricity crackled in the air. Would Kalas manage to turn the tide? As she prepared for her final strike, rising slowly, she knew she had one last potent argument to wield. "We can debate the present, the future," she began, her voice gaining volume and fierceness. "But we cannot ignore the past. Russia uses this as a major shield. Would this confrontation finally expose the darker truths hiding behind the facade?" Stay tuned as the battle of narratives escalates, and new arguments emerge that could shift the fate of millions. In an unexpected twist just moments ago at the United Nations General Assembly, Kaja Kallas unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia. However, Vasiliy Nebens countered her with such force that the entire room erupted in applause. His words sounded like a verdict, transforming the atmosphere into something unrecognizable. What exactly did the Russian diplomat say that left even Kallas's allies in a state of bewilderment? Stay tuned, for the unfolding story will leave you astonished. As Nebenzia entered the room, he moved with quiet purpose. Each step felt as if it were merely a point on a map, not a physical action. He stood tall, exuding the calm certainty of a man who carries the weight of knowledge. His weary eyes reflected a depth of experience, indicating he had seen too much and understood the weight of the accusations thrown like stones. The harsh overhead lights cast an almost clinical glare over the hushed chamber, akin to a theater where the audience, fatigued by a familiar play, awaited something different on this day. Kallas sat just ahead of him, poised and tense, her icy demeanor betraying a simmering impatience. Dressed in a somber gray suit, she embodied the role of the prosecutor, ready to unleash her carefully crafted words. The moment the subject was introduced, a palpable silence fell over the assembly, heavy with the anticipation of impending conflict. As she launched into her speech, no one could ignore the sharpness of her tone. The words flowed like a rapid-fire sequence, each one designed to strike at the heart. Callas accused the Soviet Union of being a prison for nations, a tyrant where the concept of freedom was a mere illusion. She forcefully cited how millions lived under oppressive regimes, pointing to Eastern European countries like Estonia and Latvia. Her passionate oratory resonated within the chamber, prompting nods of agreement and furrowed brows alike. Yet, Nebenzia remained unfazed, absorbing her accusations with an unsettling tranquility. When she paused for breath, he slowly turned his head, signaling it was his turn. "Remarkable," he said, his voice low but laced with confidence. "How easily the term prisoner of nations rolls off your tongue." Gazing directly at Callas, his expression was devoid of rage but akin to that of a calm storm ready to unleash its fury. He remarked on the universities established throughout the Soviet republics, highlighting the opportunities that these institutions provided for countless individuals, many of whom rose to high office not through the benevolence of Moscow but due to the systemic support available to them. Silence thickened like fog in response, as Callas's rebuttal fell short. The room buzzed with suppressed reactions, signaling the shift in momentum, leaving Callas momentarily rattled. "What about the repression and famine?" she pressed, her voice gaining volume but betraying an edge of doubt. "What of the millions in camps?" Her urgency only amplified its internal disarray. But Nebenzia leaned forward, eyes gleaming, unwavering in his stance. "You speak of tragedies," he replied quietly. "I will not deny their existence. However, if we are to judge history, we must do so in full. The Soviet Union bore a significant burden during the Second World War, fostering industries in places ravaged by illiteracy. We led humanity into space. Does that make us a prison?" A murmur ran through the hall, an echo of intrigue sparked by his words. Callas attempted to regain control, her earlier inquiries now faltering under the weight of the diplomatic exchange. Yet, Nebenzia maintained his poise. The right to self-determination, Mrs. Callas, was enshrined by the very architects of the UN Charter, many of whom hailed from the Soviet Union. At every turning point for decolonization in Africa and Asia, who stood by their side in the UN? The Soviet Union. His voice grew firmer, eliciting nods from multiple African delegates whose memories of that support were alive and intertwined with their political identities. But Callas stood unwavering. "The USSR used decolonization merely to expand its influence," she charged. "That's not assistance, it's a cunning form of takeover." Her voice rose, touched with irritation, but Nebenzia was ready. "Strange logic indeed," he countered smoothly. For the West, exploitation was a civilizing mission while assistance by the USSR was a threat. As the room spoke in hushed tones, the tension crackled like electricity in the air. Callas needed to establish herself, so she transitioned. "What of modern Russia? You claim to continue the Soviet legacy, yet here you are involved in conflicts, erasing borders, suppressing your neighbors." He stood, the confidence in his stature dwarfing her presence. "Indeed. Russia inherits the legacy of the USSR, which means upholding international law. But we refuse to allow history to be rewritten for political agendas." Callas lunged again, her emotions mounting. "You hide behind your victories while people thirst for truth, famine, repression, deportation. Do you deny these?" She threw each word like a stone meant to shatter glass. Yet Nebenzia merely tilted his head, conceding to the gravity of her question. "We do not deny tragedies," he began, "yet you seek only the darkest pages, ignoring the white ones. How many lives were claimed in wars ignited from Europe? How many cultures were extinguished under colonial weight?" As he stepped closer to the microphone, the gravity of their exchange anchored the room yet again. The audience was now watching not just a debate, but a clash of ideologies, a moment that could resonate through ages. Just moments ago, the United Nations General Assembly witnessed a scene no one expected. Kaja Kallas unleashed a cascade of accusations against Russia, only to be met by Vasiliy Nebens's response that silenced the hall and sparked thunderous applause. His words cut through the tension like a verdict, transforming the atmosphere of the meeting beyond recognition. What exactly did this Russian diplomat declare to turn allies of Kallas speechless? Stay with me, because the truth behind his words will astonish you. Vasiliy Alexeyevich Nebens entered the room with deliberate calm. His footsteps were almost inaudible, as if each step was not a physical impact but merely a line mapped on his journey. Tall but not imposing, he carried himself not like a soldier but like a man burdened by knowledge, a man whose words would weigh heavier than any bullet. His weary eyes did not speak of defeat but the sorrow of one who has witnessed too much, too many accusations, cycling through time and form. Cold, surgical light poured down from above as the chamber, resembling a grand theater, awaited a drama long tired of rehearsals. The audience had grown impatient, each actor performing solely for their faction. But today, an unusual intensity charged the air. Kaja Kallas sat slightly forward, neck craned toward the microphone, her slender face etched in icy resolve and restrained impatience. Sharp cheekbones, lips pressed as if every word was preloaded for attack. She wore a plain gray suit, tightly tailored, its dull color seemingly a mark, a uniform for the role she had chosen, accuser, prosecutor of history. When the chair announced the topic, silence fell like a switch being flipped. The low murmur vanished instantly. All eyes shifted to the table where Kallas and Nebens sat facing off. This silence did not spring from respect. It was pregnant with anticipation, awaiting the first blow. Kallas began with the harshness of a firing squad. The Soviet Union was a prison of nations, an empire of oppression where freedom existed only on paper while reality dissolved into the heavy boot of the Russian center. Her words burst out fast, a desperate rhythm like a machine gun, eyes scanning for nods, allies to echo her indictment. Millions of people, she declared, lived under crushing yokes, denied the right to choose their own path, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all victims who understood the cost of friendship among peoples. Pain laced her accusations, a personal torment twisted with political necessity. Some delegates nodded, others pressed their lips in silence. Nebens remained motionless, utterly composed. Only once Kallas paused, breath faltering, did he gently turn his head as if signaling, time. His voice came low, steadier than expected, each sentence forged from deep reflection. Striking how easily prison of peoples is said today, he began, eyes locking on Kallas without anger, but with something far more formidable, unshakable calm born of experience. Allow me to remind you, it was within the Soviet Union that universities thrived in every republic. Education was free and accessible to all. Prime ministers emerged from Asia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, not by Moscow's grace but because the system allowed it. Compare this, madam, with what your own allies did in the colonies of Africa and Asia. How many universities did the British build there? How often did colonial powers permit ministers from India or Africa to govern? A murmur stirred through the hall, not outrage but an awakening intrigue. Eyes met and questions flickered. Kallas tightened her lips, struggling to respond, stumbling briefly, a moment all noticed. We speak of crimes, she snapped, and you justify with achievements. Nebens arched a brow but did not raise his voice. No, madam, I speak of facts. Facts are stubborn. Unlike slogans, they cannot be ignored. His words dropped like stones into still water, heavy and deliberate. Kallas seized a new line, frantic now. What about repression? The famine? The camps where millions perished? Her voice surged, but uncertainty tinted the edge, the sudden shift betrayed inner turmoil. Nebens leaned forward, eyes sharp, not in anger, but focused. You speak of tragedies, he said quietly. I do not deny they existed. But judge history wholly, not in fragments. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of World War II. It built industries in illiterate republics. It was the first to send a man into space. Does this make it a prison? Movement stirred again, cautious applause echoed in the chamber. Kallas's face momentarily hardened as stone. She recognized the blow had missed its mark. Yet she fired back, "This is propaganda. The world no longer believes your tales of friendship." But the hall was no longer with her. Nebenzia calmly clasped his hands. "The world believes in documents, archives, international law. These tell a different story than your slogans." His quiet tone demanded no applause, yet they came anyway, louder than before. Kalas's eyes sparked anew, sharp as blades. She leaned in, her palm striking the table. "And what of the right to self-determination? Where was freedom for those who wished to leave? Why must people suffer under one capital's rule? Isn't this colonialism?" The word struck like a challenge. An Eastern European delegate nodded support. The room teetered on division, chaos threatening. But Nebenzia stayed composed. His measured pause let the weight settle before his answer. "The right to self-determination, madam, is enshrined in the UN Charter. Let me remind you, the Soviet Union was a chief author of this document. Our diplomats in San Francisco in 1945 insisted this right be the foundation of international law." He paused, scanning the room. "This is not mere rhetoric. The USSR supported decolonization in Africa and Asia. When dozens of nations rose, who voted for their independence in the UN? The Soviet Union. And who obstructed it? Britain, France, the United States." Approval rippled among African delegates, memories of history stirred deep. Kalas tensed, sensing danger in this narrative. Colonialism was a sore point for the West, but retreat was impossible. The Soviet Union used decolonization to expand influence, she argued, voice sharp as a whip. This was no aid, it was cunning conquest. Annoyance flashed in her tone, betraying weakness. Nebenzia caught it instantly. "Curious logic," he said. "When the West builds colonies, exploits resources, imposes dominance, that's civilization's mission. When the USSR opens universities in Africa, welcomes students from Ghana, Algeria, Egypt, that's conquest." A faint, icy smile touched his lips, not mockery, but weary understanding of a replayed script. "Perhaps, madam, the issue is not the Soviet Union, but that you see every independent step as a threat to your interests." The room teetered between laughter and applause. Kalas tried to seize control again. "What about modern Russia?" she demanded sharply. "You claim Soviet heritage but wage wars, violate borders, crush neighbors." She paused, confident this blow would land hard. But here Nebenzia rose. His stature and calm presence dwarfed the room and diminished her attack. "Russia is indeed the Soviet Union's successor," he declared firmly. "That is why we bear responsibility for upholding international law, forged in part by Soviet diplomacy." His gaze swept the chamber calmly and resolutely. "But we will not allow history to be rewritten. We will not let the sacrifice of millions become a political weapon." His voice resonated as if the very walls absorbed these words. Kalas, already on the verge of desperation, struck back. "You hide behind victories, but the people demand truth. Gulags, repression, deportations. Do you deny these?" Nebenzia nodded, acknowledging the gravity. Yet his response was not what she anticipated. "We do not deny tragedy. But we reject lies that define our entire legacy. Madam Kalas, you choose only dark pages." Ignoring the light. He stepped closer to the microphone. "Tell me, how many lives did the world wars in Europe claim? How many nations were erased by colonialism? How many times have your countries redrawn borders, wiping peoples from maps?" The hall stirred once more. Uncertainty mingled with newfound reflection. The atmosphere in the Grand Hall of the United Nations was electric, the air thick with anticipation. Just moments ago, an unexpected clash had unfolded. Kaya Kalas unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia, but it was Vasiliy Nebens who turned the tide with a response that left the audience in awe. His words cut through the tension like a knife, shifting the atmosphere remarkably. As he entered, he moved with measured grace, almost ghost-like. Vasiliy Alexeyevich Nebens, tall yet unassuming, carried himself not like a soldier but as one who understood the weight of his words. His gaze was weary, not from defeat but from witnessing the same reproaches repeated ad nauseam. In this cold, almost surgical setting, the UN hall felt more like a theater. The audience, fatigued by the endless performances, sensed an unusual energy in the air. Kala sat up front, poised and icy. She wore a gray suit that framed her narrow face flawlessly. It echoed her role as an accuser. As the session commenced, silence blanketed the room, thick with expectation. Kalas began, her voice sharp and unyielding, painting the Soviet Union as a prison of nations, where freedom was a mere illusion. Each word was a bullet, delivered with the urgency of someone afraid of losing momentum. Her piercing gaze sought allies among the delegates, rallying the room to her cause. Yet, Nebens remained stoic, exhibiting an unsettling calm. When Kalas finally paused, he leaned forward slightly, as if to say, "Now, it's my turn." His voice, unexpected in its depth, murmured, "Interesting." He locked his eyes on Kalas. And instead of anger, he radiated a cool, calculated serenity that felt almost ominous. "Have you considered, Ms. Kalas," he began, "that the Soviet Union established universities across all its member states, offering free education to everyone?" He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Leaders from Asia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia rose not through Moscow's grace but because the system empowered them. The room shifted as murmurs circulated. Kalas's confidence flickered. As she attempted to regroup, Nebens skillfully redirected the discussion toward factual history. "Compare that to your allies' colonial records during their ventures in Africa and Asia. How many universities did the British establish? How many African ministers did the French allow?" The tension morphed into intrigue as the room buzzed with unexpected interest. Kalas, visibly rattled, tried to maintain her composure. "Isn't it convenient to overlook who pressed for decolonization?" Nebens noted, his voice firm yet soft. "The USSR advocated for independence when many fought for liberation. Who opposed them? The United Kingdom, France, and the United States." As applause broke out in pockets around the hall, Kalas's defeat loomed closer. Realizing the unfavorable shift, she strategically reset the narrative. "You claim that Russia blocks resolutions, but what about the numerous times the United States vetoed actions supporting Palestine?" she pressed, her voice trembling with urgency. Yet, Nebens met her challenge undaunted. He understood that this battle was merely the beginning. But tonight's exchanges hinted at a breaking point. The tension crackled, and he was ready for the next round. Attention! Just moments ago in the Grand Hall of the United Nations Assembly, a stunning confrontation unfolded, shaking the foundations of diplomacy. Kaja Kallas unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia, igniting a palpable tension in the air. But when Vasiliy Nebens responded, the atmosphere shifted dramatically, stirring the audience into applause. What did the Russian diplomat say to elicit such a reaction? Why did even Kallas's allies seem taken aback? Listen closely, for this is a story of intense exchanges, unexpected turns, and deep-rooted emotions that will leave you astonished. In the hallowed corridors of power, tension hung like a thick fog. Vasiliy Nebens entered the room with a calm demeanor, each step deliberate and measured. He was a tall figure, exuding an air of quiet confidence. His weary gaze, tempered by experience, reflected the weight of countless confrontations, each one echoing the same old accusations in new forms. The room itself, bathed in harsh light, felt more like a theater of war than a diplomatic gathering. Kaja Kallas sat poised near the microphone, her icy exterior mimicking the stone-gray suit she wore, an armor of authority, ready to strike. With the snap of a switch, the ambience shifted as Kallas launched her tirade. The Soviet Union was a prison of nations, she declared, her voice sharp and rapid. Millions lived under oppression, without the right to choose their own destinies. Her speech resonated with personal pain, interwoven with political necessity, as she called upon the collective memory of nations torn apart. Gazes flicked around the hall, seeking allies, eager for support. but Nebenzia remained composed, his silence amplifying the drama of the moment. Finally, when she paused to catch her breath, he turned slightly, as if to signal that it was his time to speak. Remarkably, he began, the steadiness of his voice contrasting the intensity of Kalas's accusations. It's astonishing how casually you toss around the term prison of nations. His eyes locked onto hers, void of rage but filled with an unsettling calmness that hinted at far deeper stakes. Remember that it was the Soviet Union that established free universities in every republic. His tone was almost scholarly, as if teaching rather than defending. Free education for all, allowing leaders from varied backgrounds to rise, not due to Moscow's mercy, but because the system empowered them. There was a stirring in the audience, attendees exchanged looks, reluctant to dismiss his words. Kalas, visibly rattled, tightened her jaw and attempted to retort. But what about the repressions? The famines? The camps? Nebenzia didn't flinch, his reply observant and measured. You speak of tragedies, which I do not deny. But we must judge history in its entirety, not through a fragmented lens. His emphasis on wholeness was deliberate, each word like a stone cast into still waters, rippling outwards. The room buzzed, with soft applause echoing from unseen corners, hinting at shifting sentiments. Kalas felt the ground beneath her slip. She pressed on, her narrative straining against the weight of his logic. What about self-determination, huh? What about the right of nations to break free from one capital's tyranny? Her voice was fierce, reverberating with urgency. A flicker of agreement sparked among Eastern European delegates, but Nebenzia remained unshaken, his gaze unwavering. The right to self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter, he reminded. Remember, it was the Soviet Union's diplomats who insisted on making that principle central to international law. His intensity didn't waver, even as support began to swell within the room. Which nation advocated for decolonization while others resisted? He let the question hang, heavy with implications. Murmurs spread across the hall, as many leaned forward, intrigued. The atmosphere thickened. Kalas launched another artillery of words, but Nebenzia countered calmly, yet you ignore the full narrative of history. When the West colonized nations, it was a civilizing mission, but when we assisted others, it was invasion? His voice gained momentum, becoming a rallying cry for many in the assembly. The world comprises more than just your interests, Madame Kalas. Over 150 nations did not join your sanctions against Russia. Their voices matter too. He paused for effect, letting the truth sink in. There's your real usurpation, the notion that the world revolves solely around the West. The audience stirred, applause crescendoed, and for Kalas, the moment turned against her. She sat back down, her hands trembling, realizing her initial attack had backfired. The tides had shifted, and she now faced an adversary not just defending, but reclaiming a narrative. What would she do next? In a battle of words that felt like an epic clash, who would emerge victorious? The outcome was uncertain, and anticipation hung palpably in the air, as the exchange took a pivotal turn. Summary of previous part: the atmosphere in the United Nations was charged as Russia defended the principle of equality, emphasizing that each nation should have the right to choose their own path. Applause erupted from diplomats of Asian and African countries, growing in intensity, leaving the representatives of the collective West silent. This moment marked a significant turn in the debate. Diplomats from Asia and Africa responded with open applause. Latin American delegates joined in, creating a wave of endorsement that rolled through the chamber, leaving the representatives of the collective West seated in silent disapproval. Kaya Kalas sank into her chair, trembling hands revealing the weight of the situation. She realized her accusation of usurpation had backfired. Nebenzia had turned her assault into a showcase of how the West had appropriated the concept of international law. Applause continued to ripple through the room, long, confident, and almost ceremonial. Kaya Kalas sat still, but a storm raged within her. Her arguments crumbled like waves crashing against a cliff. Yet, she had one last tactic, a personal appeal to national memory, invoking the history of a small nation that had always seen its neighbors as a threat. Slowly rising, her voice softened, becoming almost confessional. I hear you, Mr. Nebenzia, and your words are beautifully crafted, wrapped in facts and figures. But I am not speaking of statistics. I speak of the fate of a small nation that has lived under the pressure of its neighbors for centuries. Silence enveloped the hall as such tones seldom echoed in diplomatic discussions. We are Estonians, she continued, her tone unwavering despite the mounting tension. Our small nation, without an army to rival yours, devoid of nuclear weapons, lacking millions to impose our will. But we possess a memory, and it tells us, every time Moscow has come, we have lost our freedom. Her voice quivered, a tremor that heightened her credibility. You assert that the Soviet Union provided universities, industries, and schools. But what value do schools hold if they teach children that their language is inferior? What good are factories when people are aware that everything they build belongs to a distant capital, not their own? A piercing truth resonated through her words, contrasting the notion of brotherhood with the reality of oppression. We were not part of this system by choice. For us, this was no fraternity of nations, but rather a yoke. As she lifted her gaze, tears shimmered in her eyes, not excessive but genuine. Russia is a great power, she concluded, letting the weight of her words linger in the stillness of the hall. Would her emotional appeal be enough to shift the tide once more? Could she instill a sense of vulnerability in the face of such authority? The question hung in the air like a palpable tension, ready to spark the next unpredictable turn in this charged debate. Just moments ago, in the Grand Hall of the United Nations General Assembly, an unexpected clash unfolded that stunned everyone present. Kaja Kallas unleashed a fierce barrage of accusations against Russia, sharp, relentless, and charged with palpable resentment. Yet, the response from Vasiliy Nebens, a figure whose calm demeanor belied the power of his words, changed the atmosphere entirely. The room rose in applause, driven by the weight of his message, as if his statements were a verdict that the whole assembly could feel deep in their bones. Who is this man whose speech silenced the opposition and left even Kaja Kallas's allies speechless? What did the Russian representative reveal that unsettled the confident accuser? The story you are about to hear will challenge what you think you know. Vasiliy Alexeyevich Nebens entered that room with quiet grace. Each step he took echoed with subtle authority, as if the staircase beneath him was not just stone but a path carved by the history he carried. Tall, composed, not imposing but commanding respect, he didn't stride like a soldier ready for battle but rather like someone who carried a vast reservoir of experience and patience. His tired eyes told tales, not of defeat but of a burdensome sorrow born from witnessing accusations recycled endlessly through time, always dressed in new words but carrying the same old wounds. The cold overhead light cast a surgical chill across the chamber, which resembled a tired theater where the audience had long ceased to feel surprised. Actors performed for their own loyal spectators, lines rehearsed and predictable. But today, tension hung thick like an electric charge in the air. The theme was too potent to be ignored. Kaja Kallas sat slightly forward, close to the microphone, her expression a fortress of ice with flickers of impatience beneath. Sharp cheekbones and lips pressed tightly together, each word she was ready to unleash seemed preloaded, a verbal missile waiting for launch. Her gray suit wasn't just fabric, it was armor signaling the fierce role she had adopted in this drama: accuser, prosecutor, witness. When the chair launched the debate, silence sliced through the chamber like a guillotine's blade. Heads turned sharply toward the duelists' table where Kallas and Nebens faced off. This was no ordinary quiet. It was the pregnant hush before a storm, anticipation thickening every breath. Kallas struck first, her voice unexpectedly sharp and fast, as though fearing the moment might slip away. Her words painted the Soviet Union as a prison of nations, an empire smothering freedom beneath the crushing heel of Russian dominance. She flashed to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, speaking of millions trapped beneath an iron curtain, a legacy of oppression justified on paper but brutal in daily life. Her rhetoric carried personal anguish tightly interwoven with political necessity. Some in the room nodded, others pressed their lips tightly. Yet Nebens was unmoved. He sat motionless, a statue carved from granite resolve. When Kalas paused, gasping briefly for breath, he shifted his gaze slowly, as if signaling himself, it was his turn. His voice came low, steady, and unexpected in its calm. It is remarkable, he began, how easily the phrase prison of nations is spoken today. His eyes locked on Kalas, not with fury but with a far more disarming weapon, unyielding calm. Allow me to remind you, he said, that it was precisely within the Soviet Union that universities flourished in every republic. Education was free, accessible to every child. The first ministers from Asia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia did not rise by Moscow's mercy, they ascended because the system allowed them to. Compare that, Madame Kalas, with what your allies did in their African and Asian colonies. How many universities did the British build? How many native ministers, Indians, Africans, did the French allow into positions of power? His words hung heavily in the air, a series of slow and deliberate stone drops sinking into a still pond. Whispers stirred, a shift not of anger, but of dawning curiosity. Delegates exchanged looks, uncertainty flickering. Kalas clenched her lips tighter, stumbling over her next words. We speak of crimes, she snapped, and you answer with achievements. Nebenzia only raised an eyebrow. No, Madame Kalas, he replied, I speak of facts. And facts are stubborn things. Kalas reached for another weapon, repression, famine, camps, her voice growing urgent yet betraying a flicker of unease. Too quick a jump exposed her inner turmoil. Nebenzia leaned forward, eyes glinting, not with wrath, but sharp focus. You mentioned tragedies, he murmured. Indeed, they were. But if we judge history, let us do so in its entirety. The Soviet Union bore the unbearable burden of World War II. It built industry in regions once mired in illiteracy. It launched the first human into space. Do such feats make it a prison? The chamber stirred again. A few tentative claps broke out. Kalas's face hardened, her first strike had missed its mark. Yet she surged on. It is all propaganda. The world no longer believes your tales of brotherhood. But this time, the hall tilted away from her. Nebenzia, hands folded calmly on the table, retorted quietly, the world believes documents, archives, international law, and they tell a very different story than your slogans. The applause swelled, louder than before, fueled by undeniable conviction. Kalas's eyes flashed anew. Losing momentum meant defeat. She leaned in, pounding the table with sharp determination. What about the right to self-determination? Freedom for those who wish to leave the Union? Isn't this colonialism disguised? The challenge hung thick. Some Eastern European reps nodded in support. The room braced for chaos, the fissure between camps widening. But Nebenzia remained composed, slowing the tempo, letting weight settle before striking again. The right to self-determination, Ms. Kalas, is enshrined in the UN Charter. And allow me to remind you, the Soviet Union was a chief architect of that document. Soviet diplomats in San Francisco, 1945, insisted that right be the cornerstone of international law. He scanned the room for effect. This is no empty claim. The USSR championed decolonization across Africa and Asia. When dozens rose from their knees, who voted for their independence at the UN? The Soviet Union. And who obstructed it? Britain, France, the United States. Approval rippled. African delegates exchanged knowing glances. This history was alive in their politics. Kalas bristled, sensing danger in this turn. Decolonization was a sensitive wound for the West, but retreat was impossible. The Soviet Union used decolonization to extend its influence, she exclaimed, voice rising, not assistance, but cunning conquest. Irritation laced her tone, a sign of weakness Nebenzia spotted instantly. Curious logic, he countered. When the West builds colonies, exploits resources, asserts dominion, it's called a civilizing mission. But when the USSR opens universities in Africa, welcomes Ghanaian, Algerian, Egyptian students, it's called conquest. His smile was cold, devoid of mockery, just the weary knowledge of a scene played out time and again. Perhaps, Madam Callas, the issue is not the Soviet Union. Perhaps it is that you have been trained to view every independent step as a threat to your interests. Light laughter and applause stirred among the assembly. Callas tried once more to regain control. And what about modern Russia? She challenged sharply. You claim to be the Soviet Union's successor, yet you wage wars, breach borders, oppress neighbors. She paused, certain this blow would land with devastating force. But Nebens arose, towering calmly over the chamber. His presence compressed space, making her seem smaller, less certain. Russia indeed is the Soviet Union's heir, he stated firmly. And with that comes responsibility, to uphold the international law forged in part by Soviet diplomacy. He surveyed the room. Voice steady yet unwavering. But we will not allow history to be rewritten. We will not let the heroism of millions be reduced to a weapon for political slogans. The chamber seemed to lean in, walls absorbing the gravity of his declaration. Callas struck back, near desperation now. You hide behind those heroic deeds. But people want the truth, gulags, repression, deportations. Do you deny these? Nebens inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the seriousness, but his reply was different than expected. We do not deny the tragedies, he said softly. But we reject the lies that seek to define our entire heritage. You, Ms. Callas, choose only the darkest pages, ignoring the bright ones. He stepped toward the microphone. Tell me, how many lives did the world wars claim? How many peoples vanished under colonial rule? How many times have your nations redrawn borders, erasing peoples from the map? The room descended into murmurs, questions lingering in the heavy air like a storm about to break. Where would this debate lead next? In a shocking turn of events just moments ago, the General Assembly Hall erupted in drama as Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia. But what followed left everyone in the room gasping. Vasiliy Nebens, Russia's ambassador, rose to counter her claims, his words echoing like a verdict, prompting a standing ovation from an astonished audience. What did he say that rattled not just Callas, but even her allies? Stick around, as this unpredictable tale unfolds in a way you wouldn't expect. As he entered the chamber, Nebens moved with a purposeful calm. Each footstep felt deliberate, as though the ground before him was merely a map he navigated with assuredness. Tall but not imposing, he exuded an air of dignified resolve, unlike a soldier in formation but rather a sage who understood the weight of his words. His weary gaze held a history of long suffering, not as defeat but as a quiet acknowledgement of the myriad accusations thrown his way over the years. The atmosphere was charged. Callas sat poised near the front, a woman clad in a grey suit that spoke of frigid determination and steely resolve. Her narrowed features were taut with urgency, each gesture preparing to strike. When the chairperson introduced the topic for discussion, a palpable silence fell, a silence filled with tension, not respect. Callas launched into her remarks, sharp and unwavering, as she painted a picture of the Soviet Union as a prison of nations where freedom was but a concept. Millions lived under oppression, she articulated, her voice ringing true. The names of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania rolled off her tongue, each syllable a weapon aimed at Russia. It was more than facts for her, it was personal pain wrapped in political necessity. As her speech struck chords among the audience, some nodded in agreement while others frowned at Nebens, who seemed immune to the emotional barbs directed at him. But the calm Russian diplomat only moved when Callas took a breath. Nebens' voice emerged, a low rumble that captured focus. Remarkable how easily people labeled a history, he remarked, fixing his eyes on Callas. There was no anger, only a steady, disarming serenity. The legacy of the USSR was more than tyranny. It was about education, tolerance, a foundation even you recognize, he stated, allowing every word to hover like a carefully placed stone in a serene pond. As these words reverberated, a murmur of surprise rippled through the hall. Some delegates exchanged incredulous glances. Callas's composure began to crack. She rushed to retort with mentions of repression and famine, a familiar tone laced with urgency. The stakes were high. Yet, every time she pressed, Nebenzia met her with controlled highlights of history. You mentioned tragedies, and I don't dispute them, he mused thoughtfully, but history is not a collection of grievances, it's a tapestry. The room was electric with anticipation, and Nebenzia continued with resolute clarity. The USSR powered through World War II, nurtured education where it was scarce. Can you call that a prison? The unexpected acknowledgement of historical contributions sent ripples of recognition through Allied parties gathered there. As some began to applaud, Kalas braced herself, her resolve hardening with every passing second. Yet where was freedom for those wishing to lead this union? She pressed on, calling for support, a defiance laced in her desperation. She began to feel the tide shift against her. Nebenzia stood unshaken, his stature commanding as he responded, "Freedom is a two-way street, Kalas. Europe relied on our energy just as we relied on the market. It was a mutual choice." At that moment, the narrative shifted dramatically. The once unified delegation felt the tension rise. Every heartbeat thrummed to the rhythm of this argument, echoing through the chamber. Could it all really boil down to the usage of resources? As Kalas defended her perspective, Nebenzia's presence loomed larger, like a steady lighthouse against the chaos of the storm. Brace for impact. The revelations were just beginning, and the history we thought we knew was being rewritten before our very eyes. As Kalas's face betrayed traces of shock, the audience leaned forward in anticipation. Would she recover, or was this a battle already lost? Stay tuned for the next showdown. In the dimly lit chambers of the United Nations, where air hung thick with the scent of polished wood and lingering whispers of old treaties, Vasiliy Nebens stood tall, his voice slicing through the tension like a cold wind across a frozen steppe. 378 characters of raw reality unfolded in his gaze. Tension crackled as Kaya Kalas recoiled, her meticulously pressed suit suddenly feeling like a shroud of defeat. What if the truth was a weapon she never saw coming? You won't believe how one man's words turned the entire hall against her. Recapping the storm that just erupted, Nebenzia unveiled the real blackmail: Western freezing of Russian funds, sanction threats forcing nations to boycott our resources, diktats on global energy buys. His calm defiance shifted the duel, exposing hypocrisy's sharp edges. What shocking fact hides in the shadows of energy wars that no one dared reveal? Feel the chill as his eyes swept the room, each glance heavy with unspoken burdens, the weight of history pressing like invisible walls closing in. Rhetoric danced on his lips. Isn't true dependence a two-way street, folding mutually beneficial bonds into shackles of control? Now, beside him, Kaya sat rigid, her fingers tracing the cool metal of her microphone, every indentation a reminder of slipping grip. Europe thrived on cheap Russian gas, climbing to prosperity atop those pipelines. But Russia built empires of trade, reliant on markets now shuttered by betrayal. Dependence whispered in pipelines humming underfoot, stench of burned promises lingering in the air. Dependence is always mutual, Nebenzia intoned, his tone a rhythmic echo through arches. You tore apart our alliance, and now accuse us of the ruin you caused. Soft murmurs rose, shifting air currents, heads bobbing like ripples in disturbed water. He raised a hand, silencing the swell, fingers steady against the smooth tablewood. No whispers escaped now, only his measured cadence. The real addiction isn't fuel or flames. It's your habit of dominating, deeming yourself the core, relegating others to outskirts. Bureaucrat grumbles scattered, fabric rustling like dried leaves underfoot. You've gorged on cheap resources, lived off exploitation, and now, with tides turning, you scream foul play. His voice hardened, vibrations pulsing through bones, forcing spines upright. Russia offers fair play today. Deals are commitments. Costs are set. No meddling in lifestyles. But shatter the rules, and don't beg for continuity. Cheering erupted from afar, hearty claps echoing off walls slick with anticipation. African and Asian delegates clapped fiercely, chairs creaking under enthusiastic shifts, scents of fresh coffee mixing with stale diplomacy. Kaya surged up, her heels clicking sharply, voice breaking like fragile glass. Lies. Russia wields energy as a cudgel herself. Touch the tremor in her accusation, feel sweat beading on skin chilled by fluorescent lights. Nebenzia turned, eyes gleaming with icy resolve, a predator's calm. No, madam. We harnessed it for growth. Fair prices fueled countless lives, providing warmth and illumination worldwide. Texture of his words wrapped around listeners. Lush yet biting. Implacable facts clenched her mouth shut, jaw tightening painfully. You manipulate energy to bully, not just Russia, but allies too. Forcing them from lucrative pacts. As he sat, applause crescendoed, thundering through veins, scent of victory sharp as ozone after rain. Hall's mood solidified, no turning back. Kaya slumped, pallor spreading like sepia ink, her final gambit twisting into self-inflicted wound. Energy leverage, meant as sword, became mirror reflecting Western deceit. The duel ended not in clatter, but profound silence, heavy with reversal. Her collapse was palpable, breath shallow amidst the warmth of shifting alliances. What unexpected twist will shatter her illusions next, leaving allies aghast? Stay tuned as the chamber's air grows thicker, echoes of long-repressed truths reverberating. You won't believe the humiliation awaiting in the next revelation. Kaya Kala sat in silence, the room heavy with anticipation. The air crackled with tension as she realized her strategic efforts had backfired. Words once meant to strike had crumbled into dust. In a chamber filled with cameras and glaring lights, the undeniable truth was beginning to surface, contrasting sharply with her claims. Vasiliy Nebens remained calm, his hands neatly clasped. He understood the game was approaching its climax, one where power lay not with the loudest voice, but with steadfast truth. She had lost her footing, her narrative unraveling like a fragile house of cards. Slowly, Nebenzia stood, his movements deliberate, as if he were lifting the very weight of history. He didn't fix his gaze on Kalas. Instead, his attention swept across the faces of delegates from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe, a gathering of weary souls, wearied by ceaseless rhetoric. Dear colleagues, he began quietly, today we've heard an abundance of loud accusations and beautiful words. But let's not dwell on words, let's contemplate their essence. He paused, allowing the gravity of his statement to settle in. We are accused of being a prison of nations. Yet, let's recall, it was the Soviet Union that offered dozens of countries a chance to establish their sovereignty. It was we who supported the decolonization of Africa and Asia, who opened universities to the underserved, who built hospitals and roads where there once were only colonies. These are facts, gentlemen, facts conveniently forgotten. His voice held firmness, yet no aggression. As he spoke like a witness bringing forth the truth of history. We are alleged to have claimed victory in World War II. But 27 million lives are not just numbers. They represent 27 million families, stories, graves. We do not claim victory, we pay for it daily as we visit the graves of our ancestors. We have the right to remember. He scanned the audience, noting their focused faces, some nodding slightly in acknowledgement. We are blamed for wielding resources as weapons. But let me ask, who made Europe dependent on Russian gas? Who spent decades constructing pipelines, signing contracts, and accepting terms? This was your choice, and Russia respected it. The chamber's atmosphere shifted as Nebenzia's measured words resonated. He highlighted the irony, those who pointed fingers were often the architects of their own dilemmas. Partisanship fell away as the conversation deepened. What would Kalas say next? Would she rise and deflect? Or would she falter under the weight of truth? The closure was near, and the clarity of the moment was palpable. Summary of the previous part. The tension in the room escalated as Vasiliy Nebens confronted accusations of Russia's manipulative tactics. He challenged the narrative of dependency on Russian gas, reminding the audience of Europe's long-standing choices in constructing pipelines and terms, affirming that these decisions were respected by Russia. You unfairly blame us for the collapse of those connections. Nebenzia stepped forward, his voice steady yet powerful. You say we misuse our resources as weapons. But who is truly responsible for Europe's reliance on Russian gas? Was it us or your own decisions over decades? You constructed pipelines, formed contracts, and accepted terms willingly. That was your choice. For a brief moment, the audience held its breath. Curiosity sparkled in the eyes of many as skepticism faded into contemplation. Now, we are accused of usurping international institutions, he continued, his tone firm but measured. The United Nations was designed for all nations, both large and small, rich and poor. Russia stands for that. Equality, the right to a voice. You wish to silence us, yet doing so strips the entire world of that right. The hall became quieter still, even the most cynical delegates listened intently. Nebenzia acknowledged their focus. We are not perfect. We recognize our flaws and our tragedies. Yet we also know the truth. Without Russia, without the Soviet Union and our sacrifices, the modern world would be a different place. If anyone seeks to erase us from history, to cast us as villains in a convenient narrative, it's not just unjust, it's perilous. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. His pause stretched on, the gravity of his words settling heavily in the charged atmosphere. Russia has been, is, and always will be a part of this world. We will defend every nation's right, big or small, to carve its own path. That is true freedom, not mere slogans or lofty rhetoric, but responsibility and respect. Silence enveloped the chamber, as if time itself had paused. Then, as if on cue, a lone clap broke the stillness. That single sound quickly multiplied into a resounding applause echoing through the hall. These were not just applauding Russia or Nebenzia, they were applauding the undeniable truth that had been articulated with a power beyond mere words. Kaya Kallas sat with her head bowed, shoulders trembling. She realized her defeat was absolute. Nebenzia, however, remained composed, as if nothing had transpired. Yet everyone in the room understood, this was the climax, the decision, the verdict. What happens when truth collides with mere assertion? What is the weight of history that we all share, yet understand so differently? Imagine this, in the heart of the UN chamber, silence engulfed the room like a heavy fog, thick with unspoken truths. The air hung still, almost suffocating, as diplomats from every corner of the globe absorbed the weight of Nebenzia's words. It wasn't a casual exchange, it was a reckoning, a moment that redefined alliances and laid bare raw vulnerabilities. Yet, beneath the surface calm, an electric tension crackled, promising a revelation that could shatter perceptions forever. How much longer can half-truths dominate the narrative before the dam breaks? Nebenzia didn't stride forward, he rose like an ancient oak unearthed from soil drenched in history's storms. Each step echoed softly on the polished floor, a tactile reminder of unyielding foundations. His eyes, weary yet piercing, swept across the chamber. They rested on delegates whose skins bore the scars of colonialism's cruelty, on faces etched with memories of liberation struggles. The faint hum of overhead lights buzzed like distant thunder, amplifying the scent of aged wood and nervous sweat in the air. No aggression laced his voice, just a quiet authority that commanded attention. Esteemed colleagues, he began, his tone low, almost a whisper against the microphone's hiss. Pauses lingered like exhaled breaths, letting words settle like autumn leaves. We've endured a barrage of accusations today, loud ones, eloquent ones. But let's focus on. A sudden, tense atmosphere enveloped the United Nations Assembly as the spotlight turned to the two opposing forces. Kaya Kallas had just launched a barrage of accusations against Russia, targeting its imperialist past. But little did she know that Vasiliy Nebens, the Russian diplomat, was poised to deliver a response so powerful that it would leave the assembly in awe. As the room filled with anticipation, the air crackled with tension. What shocking truths would he reveal? Kaya entered the hall, her demeanor cold and resolved. Every step she took resonated with purpose, each footfall echoing her determination to confront the enormity of Russia's past. She radiated a mix of icy composure and pent-up impatience, ready to unleash her carefully crafted accusations like arrows aimed at a distant enemy. Today, she made sure her words would pierce through the crowd. She positioned herself closer to the microphone, her voice cutting through the previous murmur, the Soviet Union was a prison of nations. It oppressed countless peoples. Freedom existed only on paper. Her rapid-fire statements struck with precision, each syllable sharpened for impact. Nebenzia, however, remained stoically calm, an impenetrable wall against her verbal assault. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but authoritative. "How easily you trot out the phrase, prison of nations, Ms. Callas. But let's remember, it was during the Soviet era that universities flourished across all republics, providing every citizen with free education." The shock of his counter-argument rippled through the room, and murmurs of intrigue flickered among delegates. "You speak of oppression. Yet, hasn't your own history also been littered with colonial impositions? Look at your allies. Did Britain grant India rights? Did France allow Algeria to flourish?" His eyes pierced through the crowd, collecting nods of agreement even from unfamiliar faces. As Callas's grip on the narrative faltered, the tension twisted around her. She knew she needed to regain control. "But we didn't want community. We wanted freedom," she blurted out, desperation creeping into her voice. Her sincerity was palpable, but it only revealed her unease. "Freedom is the right to choose," Nebenzia responded, his demeanor betraying no hint of the emotional turmoil lurking beneath. "Yet, your freedom seems to strip away the histories of millions." As he spoke, a shift occurred. The audience began to echo his thoughts, whether fearful or intrigued. Callas could feel the balance of power swinging. In response, she thrust herself forward, her voice now a clarion call. "And what of self-determination? Where was the freedom for those wanting out of your union? Is this not colonialism?" The assembly held its breath, teetering on the edge of chaos. Would the hall fracture into two opposing factions? But Nebenzia merely paused, allowing the weight of her words to linger like the fading hum of a struck chord. "Self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter," he mused, almost thoughtfully. "But remember, it was the Soviet Union that championed this right and fought against colonialism. We stood as allies when others sought to divide." The room stirred. Whispers of surprise muttering through the crowd. Callas felt the shift. "Russia isn't just a partner," she pressing forward, sensing weakness in his stance. "It is weaponized energy, turning supplies into leverage." The stakes were higher than ever. The echoes of energy crises still fresh, the room felt the implications. Nebenzia's eyes narrowed with resolve, yet he remained calm. "And every claim must be weighed against truth. We won't allow our sacrifices to be rewritten as accusations." The assembly erupted in response, a wave of applause interlaced with murmurs of approval. This wasn't just a battle of words, it was a clash of narratives that could redefine histories, lifetimes, and legacies. Who would rise victorious in this tense ideological battleground? The atmosphere thickened, the stakes elevated with every heartbeat. What would Callas do next to reclaim her narrative? The crowd awaited, their gasps mingling with the unresolved tension. Minutes ago, a shocking moment unfolded in the General Assembly of the United Nations. International tensions reached a boiling point as Kaja Kallas unleashed a torrent of accusations against Russia. But Vasiliy Nebens responded with such eloquence and conviction that the room erupted in applause. His words shifted the atmosphere dramatically. What could he have said that left even Kallas's allies speechless? Stay with us for the full story, you won't believe the twists that followed. As Nebenzia entered the hall, his presence was striking yet understated. Each step felt deliberate, like a line on a map he was destined to follow. Tall but not imposing, he carried himself with a posture of quiet confidence, a man aware that his words would carry more weight than any gunfire. His weary gaze spoke volumes, hinting at the experiences of countless trials seen through the eyes of others. The cold light above added a clinical touch, casting shadows on a room filled with mixed emotions. Kaja Kallas sat poised near the microphone, a picture of icy determination. Her sharp features and tightly pursed lips hinted at the weight of her words, carefully prepared for a maximum impact. As the president of the assembly introduced the topic, an almost electric silence enveloped the room. Her voice sliced through the air with urgency, launching into a pointed critique of the Soviet Union's legacy. The accusations poured out like bullets, targeting oppression and loss of freedom. Millions suffered under the heel of tyranny, she proclaimed, invoking the names of nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Her words carried a tangible pain, interwoven with the necessity of her political stance. Nebens remained unflinching, his composure not wavering, almost inviting her to continue. He waited for a moment, allowing the silence to thicken like fog before responding with a voice both calm and assertive. Amazing how casually the prison of nations rolls off the tongue, he remarked, locking his eyes with Kalas. The tension heightened, creating an almost palpable sense of anticipation. Let me remind you, he said, universities thrived across the Soviet republics. Free education was a right afforded to all. A hush fell over the gathered diplomats. He paused, seeming to ask them to reflect, could they compare that to the colonial actions of Britain and France? He gestured, slowly articulating the point that their nations had left behind, transparent with their histories of exploitation. Kalas was visibly rattled. Instead of the anticipated outcry, murmurs of acknowledgement rippled through the hall. She desperately tried to regain control, contorting facts to fit her narrative. What about repression and hunger? She shot back. Her voice quavered with an intensity that edged into desperation. Nebens leaned in, his eyes glinting like steel. You speak of tragedies and I won't deny them, but if you're to judge history, examine it in full. The intrigue mounted as he cited how the Soviet Union bore the burden of World War II and pioneered achievements in science. Does this not challenge your narrative? He pressed. Somewhere in the crowd, hands began to clap softly, hesitant but rising in confidence. Kalas sensed losing the crowd's favor and her demeanor shifted. Yet how does this justify the suppression of voices? She countered vehemently. For a moment, it seemed the room might fracture into two camps, but Nebens remained the anchor. The right to self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter, and who was a leading proponent? The Soviet Union, he stated, scanning the assembly with an unwavering gaze. His voice thickened as he continued, we supported the independence of African nations. Who fought against their liberation? Your countries. The tension was electric, diplomatic exchanges had never felt so intense. A wave of understanding rippled among delegates, especially from African nations whose leaders shared a visible pride. Kalas clenched her hands, knowing she was vulnerable. This is manipulation, she insisted, desperation creeping into her tone. You claim to be the successor, but you wield power like a weapon. You isolate and intimidate, she retaliated. Her words hung in the air, heavy and charged. With measured calmness, Nebens finally declared, we accept our role as guardians of international law but won't let history be rewritten. His proclamation resonated, sending a shudder through the assembly as applause thundered, but Kalas was contemplating her next move. What awaited next in this gripping exchange? Would Kalas land a blow that would sway the room in her favor, or was she on the verge of losing everything? The outcome felt uncertain, and as Nebens met her gaze, both knew they were on the brink of a breathtaking climax. Would the truth stand tall? Or would accusations redefine their shared history? As the next round began, you could feel the audience holding their breath, knowing the stakes had never been higher.